Book 14th Warn. In the year of the consulship of Caius Viustinus and Caius Fonteius, Nero deferred no more a long-meditated crime. Length of power had matured his daring, and his passion for Poppaea daily grew more ardent. As the woman had no hope of marriage for herself, or of Octavia's divorce, while Agrippina lived, she would reproach the emperor with incessant vituperation, and sometimes call him in jest a mere ward who was under the rule of others, and was so far from having empire that he had not even his liberty. Why, she asked, was her marriage put off? Was it, forsooth, her beauty and her ancestors with their triumphal honors that failed to please, or her being a mother and her sincere heart? No, the fear was that as a wife at least she would divulge the wrongs of the Senate and the wrath of the people at the arrogance and rapacity of his mother. If the only daughter-in-law Agrippina could bear was one who wished evil to her son, let her be restored to her union with Otho. She would go anywhere in the world where she might hear of the insults heaped on the emperor rather than witness them, and be also involved in his perils. These and the like complaints, rendered impressive by tears, and by the cunning of an adulteress, no one checked, as all longed to see the mother's power broken. While not a person believed that the son's hatred would steel his heart to her murder. 2. Cluvius relates that Agrippina, in her eagerness to retain her influence, went so far that more than once at midday, when Nero, even at that hour, was flushed with wine and feasting, she presented herself attractively attired to her half-intoxicated son, and offered him her person, and that when kinsfolk observed wanton kisses and caresses, portending infamy, it was Seneca who sought a female's aid against a woman's fascinations, and hurried in Acte, the freed girl who, alarmed at her own peril and at Nero's disgrace, told him that the incest was notorious, as his mother boasted of it, and that the soldiers would never endure the rule of an impious sovereign. Fabius Rusticus tells us that it was not Agrippina, but Nero, who leu stead for the crime, and that it was frustrated by the adroitness of that same freed girl. Cluvius's account, however, is also that of all other authors, and popular belief inclines to it, whether it was that Agrippina really conceived such a monstrous wickedness in her heart, or perhaps because the thought of a strange passion seemed comparatively credible in a woman who in her girlish years had allowed herself to be seduced by Lepidus in the hope of woman power, had stooped with a like ambition to the lust of power, and had trained herself for every infamy by her marriage with her uncle. 3. Nero accordingly avoids secret interviews with her, and when she withdrew to her gardens or to her estates at Tusculum and Antium, he praised her for courting repose. At last, convinced that she would be too formidable wherever she might dwell, he resolved to destroy her, merely deliberating whether it was to be accomplished by poison, or by the sword, or by any other violent means. Poison at first seemed best, but were it to be administered at the imperial table, the result could not be referred to chance after the recent circumstances of the death of Britannicus. Again, to tamper with the servants of a woman who, from her familiarity with crime, was on her guard against treachery, appeared to be extremely difficult, and then, too, she had fortified her constitution by the use of antidotes. How, again, the dagger and its work were to be kept secret, no one could suggest, and it was feared, too, that whoever might be chosen to execute such a crime would spurn the order. An ingenious suggestion was offered by Tacitus, a freedman, commander of the fleet at Misenum, who had been tutored in Nero in boyhood, and had a hatred of Agrippina which she reciprocated. He explained that a vessel could be constructed from which a part might by a contrivance be detached, when out at sea, so as to plunge her unawares into the water. Nothing, he said, allowed of accident so much as the sea, and should she be overtaken by shipwreck, who would be so unfair as to impute to crime an offense committed by the winds and waves, the emperor would add the honor of a temple and of shrines to the deceased lady with every other display of filial affection. 4. Nero liked the device, favored as it also was by the particular time, for he was celebrating Minerva's 5 days' festival at Baiae. Thither he enticed his mother by repeated assurances that children ought to bear with the irritability of parents and to soothe their tempers. Wishing thus to spread a rumor of reconciliation and to secure Agrippina's acceptance through the feminine credulity, which easily believes what joy. As she approached, he went to the shore to meet her. She was coming from Antium, welcomed her with outstretched hand and embrace, and conducted her to Belai. This was the name of a country house, washed by a bay of the sea between the promontory Messinum and the lake of Baiae. Here was a vessel distinguished from others by its equipment, seemingly meant, among other things, to do honor to his mother, for she had been accustomed to sail in a trireme with a crew of marines, and now she was invited to a banquet that night might serve to conceal the crime. It was well known that somebody had been found to betray it, that Agrippina had heard of the plot, and in doubt whether she was to believe it, was conveyed to Baiae in her litter. There some soothing words allayed her fear. She was graciously received, and seated at table above the emperor. Nero prolonged the banquet with various conversation, passing from a youth's playful familiarity to an air of constraint, which seemed to indicate serious thought, and then, after protracted festivity, escorted her on her departure, clinging with kisses to her eyes and bosom, either to crown his hypocrisy or because the last sight of a mother on the eve of destruction caused a lingering even in that brutal heart. 5. A night of brilliant starlight with the calm of a tranquil sea was granted by heaven, seemingly to convict the crime. The vessel had not gone far, Agrippina having with her 2 of her intimate attendants, one of whom, Cyprius Gallus, stood near the helm, while Acerronia, reclining at Agrippina's feet as she reposed herself, spoke joyfully of her son's repentance and of the recovery of the mother's influence, when at a given signal the ceiling of the place, which was loaded with a quantity of lead, fell in and Creperius was crushed and instantly killed. Agrippina and Acerronia were protected by the projecting sides of the couch, which happened to be too strong to yield under the weight. But this was not followed by the breaking up of the vessel, for all were bewildered, and those 2 who were in the plot were hindered by the unconscious majority. The crew then thought it best to throw the vessel on one side and so sink it, but they could not themselves promptly unite to face the emergency, and others, by counteracting the attempt, gave an opportunity of a gentler fall into the sea. Acerronia, however, thoughtlessly exclaiming that she was Agrippina, and imploring help for the emperor's mother, was dispatched with poles and oars, and such naval implements as chance offered. Agrippina was silent and was thus the less recognized. Still, she received a wound in her shoulder. She swam, then met with some small boats, which conveyed her to the Lucrine lake, and so entered her house. 6. There she reflected how for this very purpose she had been invited by a lying letter, and treated with conspicuous honor, how also it was near the shore, not from being driven by winds or dashed on rocks, that the vessel had in its upper part collapsed, like a mechanism anything but nautical. She pondered too the death of Acerronia. She looked at her own wound and saw that her only safeguard against treachery was to ignore it. Then she sent her freedman Agerinus to tell her son how by heaven's favor and H's good fortune she had escaped a terrible disaster, that she begged him, alarmed as he might be by his mother's peril, to put off the duty of a visit. As for the present, she needed repose. Meanwhile, pretending that she felt secure, she applied remedies to her wound and fomentations to her person. She then ordered search to be made for the will of Acerronia, and her property to be sealed, in this alone throwing off disguise. 7. Nero, meantime, as he waited for tidings of the consummation of the deed, received information that she had escaped with the injury of a slight wound, after having so far encountered the peril that there could be no question as to its author. Then, paralyzed with terror and protesting that she would show herself the next moment eager for vengeance, either arming the slaves or stirring up the soldiery, or hastening to the Senate and the people to charge him with the wreck with her wound, and with the destruction of her friends, he asked what resource he had against all this, unless something could be at once devised by Burrus and Seneca. He had instantly summoned both of them, and possibly they were already in the secret. There was a long silence on their part. They feared they might remonstrate in vain, or believe the crisis to be such that Nero must perish, unless Agrippina were at once crushed. Thereupon Seneca was so far the more prompt as to glance back on Burrus, as if to ask him whether the bloody deed must be required of the soldiers. Burrus replied that the Praetorians were attached to the whole family of the Caesars, and remembering Germanicus would not dare a savage deed on his offspring. It was for Tacitus to accomplish his promise. Tacitus, without a pause, claimed for himself the consummation of the crime. At those words, Nero declared that that day gave him empire, and that a freedman was the author of this mighty boon. "Go," he said with all speed, "and take with you the men readiest to execute your orders." He himself, when he had heard of the arrival of Agrippina's messenger, Agerinus, contrived a theatrical mode of accusation, and, while the man was repeating his message, threw down a sword at his feet, then ordered him to be put in irons as a detected criminal, so that he might invent a story how his mother had plotted the emperor's destruction, and in the shame of discovered guilt had by her own choice sought death. Meantime, Agrippina's peril being universally known and taken to be an accidental occurrence, everybody, the moment he heard of it, hurried down to the beach. Some climbed projecting piers, some the nearest vessels, others, as far as their stature allowed, went into the sea. Some again stood with outstretched arms, while the whole shore rung with wailings, with prayers and cries, as different questions were asked and uncertain answers given. A vast multitude streamed to the spot with torches, and as soon as all knew that she was safe, they at once prepared to wish her joy, till the sight of an armed and threatening force scared them away. Tacitus then surrounded the house with a guard, and having burst open the gates, dragged off the slaves who met him, till he came to the door of her chamber, where a few still stood after the rest had fled in terror at the attack. A small lamp was in the room, and one slave girl with Agrippina, who grew more and more anxious, as no messenger came from her son, not even Agerinus, while the appearance of the shore was changed, a solitude one moment, then sudden bustle and tokens of the worst catastrophe. As the girl rose to depart, she exclaimed, "Do you too forsake me?" And looking round, saw Tacitus, who had with him the captain of the trireme, Herculeus, and Oberetus, a centurion of marines. "If," said she, "you have come to see me, take back word that I have recovered, but if you are here to do a crime, I believe nothing about my son. He has not ordered his mother's murder." The assassins closed in round her couch, and the captain of the trireme first struck her head violently with a club. Then, as the centurion bared his sword for the fatal deed, presenting her person, she exclaimed, "Smite my womb," and with many wounds she was slain. 9. So far our accounts agree. That Nero gazed on his mother after her death and praised her beauty, some have related, while others deny it. Her body was burnt that same night on a dining couch, with a mean funeral. Nor, as long as Nero was in power, was the earth raised into a mound, or even decently clothed. Subsequently, she received from the solicitude of her domestics a humble sepulchre on the road to Misenum, near the country house of Caesar the dictator, which from a great height commands a view of the bay beneath. As soon as the funeral pile was lighted, one of her freedmen, surnamed Nestor, ran himself through with a sword, either from love of his mistress or from the fear of destruction. Many years before, Agrippina had anticipated this end for herself, and had spurned the thought. For when she consulted the astrologers about Nero, they replied that he would be emperor and kill his mother. "Let him kill her," she said, "provided he is emperor." 10. But the emperor, when the crime was at last accomplished, realized its portentous guilt. The rest of the night, now silent and stupefied, now and still oftener starting up in terror, bereft of reason, he awaited the dawn as if it would bring with it his doom. He was first encouraged to hope by the flattery addressed to him, at the prompting of Burrus by the centurions and tribunes, who again and again pressed his hand and congratulated him on his having escaped an unforeseen danger and his mother's daring crime. Then his friends went to the temples, and, an example having once been set, the neighboring towns of Campania testified their joy with sacrifices and deputations. He himself, with an opposite phase of hypocrisy, seemed sad and almost angry at his own deliverance, and shed tears over his mother's death. But as the aspects of places change not, as do the looks of men, and as he had ever before his eyes the dreadful sight of that sea with its shores, some too believed that the notes of a funereal trumpet were heard from the surrounding heights, and wailings from the mother's grave. He retired to Neapolis and sent a letter to the Senate, the drift of which was that Agerinus, one of Agrippina's confidential freedmen, had been detected with the dagger of an assassin, and that in the consciousness of having planned the crime, she had paid its penalty. 11. He even revived the charges of a period long past, how she had aimed at a share of empire, and at inducing the praetorian cohorts to swear obedience to a woman, to the disgrace of the Senate and people. How, when she was disappointed in her fury with the soldiers, the Senate, and the populace, she opposed the usual donative and largesse, and organized perilous prosecutions against distinguished citizens. What efforts had it cost him to hinder her from bursting into the Senate House and giving answers to foreign nations? He glanced, too, with indirect censure at the days of Claudius, and ascribed all the abominations of that reign to his mother, thus seeking to show that it was the state's good fortune which had destroyed her. For he actually told the story of the shipwreck. But who could be so stupid as to believe that it was accidental, or that a shipwrecked woman had sent one man with a weapon to break through an emperor's guards and fleets? So now it was not Nero, whose brutality was far beyond any remonstrance, but Seneca, who was in ill repute for having written a confession in such a style. Still, there was a marvelous rivalry among the nobles in decreeing thanksgivings at all the shrines, and the celebration with annual games of Minerva's festival, as the day on which the plot had been discovered, also. That a golden image of Minerva with a statue of the emperor by its side should be set up in the Senate House, and that Agrippina's birthday should be classed among the inauspicious days. Eusebius, who had been used to pass over previous flatteries in silence or with brief assent, then walked out of the Senate, thereby imperiling himself without communicating to the other senators any impulse towards freedom. There occurred, too, a thick succession of portents which meant nothing. A woman gave birth to a snake, and another was killed by a thunderbolt in her husband's embrace. Then the sun was suddenly darkened, and the 14 districts of the city were struck by lightning. All this happened quite without any providential design, so much so that for many subsequent years Nero prolonged his reign and his crimes. Still, to deepen the popular hatred towards his mother, and prove that since her removal his clemency had increased, he restored to their ancestral homes 2 distinguished ladies, Junia and Calpurnia, with 2 ex-praetors, Valerius Capito and Laecinio Escabulus, whom Agrippina had formerly banished. He also allowed the ashes of Lalia Paulina to be brought back, and a tomb to be built over them. Iturius and Calvisius, whom he had himself temporarily exiled, he now released from their penalty. Solana indeed had died a natural death at Tarentum, whither she had returned from her distant exile, when the power of Agrippina, to whose enmity she owed her fall, began to totter, or her wrath was at last appeased. 13. While Nero was lingering in the towns of Campania, doubting how he should enter Rome, whether he would find the Senate submissive and the populace enthusiastic, all the vilest courtiers, and of these never had a court a more abundant crop, argued against his hesitation by assuring him that Agrippina's name was hated, and that her death had heightened his popularity. He might go without a fear, they said, and experience in his person men's veneration for him. They insisted at the same time on preceding him. They found greater enthusiasm than they had promised, the tribes coming forth to meet him. The Senate in holiday attire, troops of their children and wives arranged according to sex and age, tiers of seats raised for the spectacle, where he was to pass as a triumph is witnessed. Thus elated and exulting over his people's slavery, he proceeded to the Capitol, performed the thanksgiving, and then plunged into all the excesses, which, though ill-restrained, some sort of respect for his mother had for a while delayed. 14. He had long had a fancy for driving a 4-horse chariot, and a no less degrading taste for singing to the harp in a theatrical fashion when he was at dinner. This, he would remind people, was a royal custom, and had been the practice of ancient chiefs. It was celebrated, too, in the praises of poets, and was meant to show honor to the gods. Songs, indeed, he said, were sacred to Apollo, and it was in the dress of a singer that great and prophetic deity was seen in Roman temples, as well as in Greek cities. He could no longer be restrained when Seneca and Burrus thought it best to concede one point that he might not persist in both. A space was enclosed in the Vatican Valley where he might manage his horses without the spectacle being public. Soon he actually invited all the people of Rome, who extolled him in their praises like a mob which craves for amusements and rejoices when a prince draws them the same way. However, the public exposure of his shame acted on him as an incentive instead of sickening him, as men expected. Imagining that he mitigated the scandal by disgracing many others, he brought on the stage descendants of noble families, who sold themselves because they were paupers. As they have ended their days, I think it due to their ancestors not to hand down their names. And indeed, the infamy is his who gave them wealth to reward their degradation, rather than to deter them from degrading himself. He prevailed, too, on some well-known Roman knights, by immense presents, to offer their services in the amphitheater. Only pay from one who is able to command carries with it the force of compulsion. 15. Still, not yet wishing to disgrace himself on a public stage, he instituted some games under the title of juvenile sports, for which people of every class gave in their names. Neither rank nor age nor previous high promotion hindered anyone from practicing the art of a Greek or Latin actor, and even stooping to gestures and songs unfit for a man. Noble ladies, too, actually played disgusting parts, and in the grove, with which Augustus had surrounded the lake for the naval fight, there were erected places for meeting and refreshment, and every incentive to excess was offered for sale. Money, too, was distributed, which the respectable had to spend under sheer compulsion, and which the profligate gloried in squandering. Hence a rank growth of abominations and of all infamy. Never did a more filthy rabble add a worse licentiousness to our long corrupted morals. Even with virtuous training, purity is not easily upheld. Far less amid rivalries and vice could modesty or propriety or any trace of good manners be preserved. Last of all, the emperor himself came on the stage, tuning his lute with elaborate care and trying his voice with his attendants. There were also present, to complete the show, a guard of soldiers with centurions and tribunes, and burghers, who grieved and yet applauded. Then it was that Roman knights were first enrolled under the title of Augustani, men in their prime and remarkable for their strength, some from a natural frivolity, others from the hope of promotion. Day and night they kept up a thunder of applause, and applied to the emperor's person and voice the epithets of deities. Thus they lived in fame and honor, as if on the strength of their merits. Nero, however, that he might not be known only for his accomplishments as an actor, also affected a taste for poetry, and drew round him persons who had some skill in such compositions but not yet generally recognized. They used to sit with him, stringing together verses prepared at home or extemporized on the spot, and fill up his own expressions, such as they were, just as he threw them off. This is plainly shown by the very character of the poems, which have no vigor or inspiration or unity in their flow. He would also bestow some leisure after his banquets on the teachers of philosophy, for he enjoyed the wrangles of opposing dogmatists, and some there were who liked to exhibit their gloomy faces and looks as one of the amusements of the court. 17. About the same time a trifling beginning led to frightful bloodshed between the inhabitants of Nuceria and Pompeii, at a gladiatorial show exhibited by Livinius Regulus, who had been, as I have related, expelled from the Senate. With the unruly spirit of townsfolk, they began with abusive language of each other. Then they took up stones, and at last weapons, the advantage are esting with the populace of Pompeii, where the show was being exhibited. And so there were brought to Rome a number of the people of Nuceria, with their bodies mutilated by wounds, and many lamented the deaths of children or of parents. The emperor entrusted the trial of the case to the Senate, and the Senate to the consuls, and then again the matter being referred back to the senators, the inhabitants of Pompeii were forbidden to have any such public gathering for 10 years. And all associations they had formed in defiance of the laws were dissolved. Livinius and the others who had excited the disturbance were punished with exile. 18. Pedius Blasius was also expelled from the Senate on the accusation of the people of Cyrene that he had violated the treasury of Aesculapius and had tampered with a military levy by bribery and corruption. This same people prosecuted Acilius Strabo, who had held the office of praetor, and had been sent by Claudius to adjudicate on some lands which were bequeathed by King Apion, their former possessor, together with his kingdom to the Roman people, and which had since been seized by the neighboring proprietors, who trusted to a long-continued license in Rome, as if it constituted right and justice. Consequently, when the adjudication was against them, there arose a bitter feeling towards the judge, but the Senate replied that they knew nothing of the instructions given by Claudius, and that the emperor must be consulted. Nero, though he approved Strabo's decision, wrote word that nevertheless he was for relieving the allies, and that he waived all claim to what had been taken into possession. 19. Then followed the deaths of two illustrious men, Domitius Afer and Marcus Servilius, who had flourished through a career of the highest honors and great eloquence. The first was a pleader. Servilius, after long practice in the courts, distinguished himself by his history of Rome and by the refinement of his life, which the contrast of his character to that of Afer, whom he equaled in genius, rendered the more conspicuous. 20. In Nero's fourth consulship with Cornelius Cassus for his colleague, a theatrical entertainment to be repeated every 5 years was established at Rome in imitation of the Greek festival. Like all novelties, it was variously canvassed. There were some who declared that even Cneius Pompeius was censured by the older men of the day for having set up a fixed and permanent theater. Formerly, they said, the games were usually exhibited with hastily erected tiers of benches and a temporary stage, and the people stood to witness them, that they might not, by having the chance of sitting down, spend a succession of entire days in idleness. Let the ancient character of these shows be retained, whenever the praetors exhibited them, and let no citizen be under the necessity of competing, as it was the morality of their fathers, which had by degrees been forgotten, was utterly subverted by the introduction of a lax tone, so that all which could suffer or produce corruption was to be seen at Rome, and a degeneracy bred by foreign taste was infecting the youth who devoted themselves to athletic sports, to idle loungings and low intrigues, with the encouragement of the emperor and senate, who not only granted license to vice, but even applied a compulsion to drive Roman nobles into disgracing themselves on the stage. Under the pretense of being orators and poets, what remained for them but to strip themselves naked, put on the boxing glove, and practice such battles instead of the arms of legitimate warfare? Would justice be promoted, or would they serve on the knights' commissions for the honorable office of a judge, because they had listened with critical sagacity to effeminate strains of music and sweet voices? Night, too, was given up to infamy, so that virtue had not a moment left to her. But all the vilest of that promiscuous throng dared to do in the darkness anything they had lusted for in the day. 21. Many people liked this very license, but they screened it under respectable names. Our ancestors, they said, were not averse to the attractions of shows on a scale suited to the wealth of their day, and so they introduced actors from the Etruscans and horse races from Thurii, when we had possessed ourselves of Achaia and Asia. And Asia, games were exhibited with greater elaboration, and yet no one at Rome of good family had stooped to the theatrical profession during the 200 years following the triumph of Lucius Mummius, who first displayed this kind of show in the capital. Besides, even economy had been consulted when a permanent edifice was erected for a theater, in preference to a structure raised and fitted up yearly at vast expense. Nor would the magistrates as hitherto exhaust their substance, or would the populace have the same motive for demanding of them the Greek contests, when once the state undertakes the expenditure. The victories won by orators and poets would furnish a stimulus to genius, and it could not be a burden for any judge to bestow his attention on graceful pursuits or on legitimate recreations. It was to mirth rather than to profligacy that a few nights every 5 years were devoted, and in these, amid such a blaze of illumination, no lawless conduct could be concealed. This entertainment, it is true, passed off without any notorious scandal. The enthusiasm, too, of the populace was not even slightly kindled, for the pantomimic actors, though permitted to return to the stage, were excluded from the sacred contests. No one gained the first prize for eloquence, but it was publicly announced that the emperor was victorious, Greek dresses in which most people showed themselves during this festival had then gone out of fashion. 22. A comet, meantime, blazed in the sky, which in popular opinion always portends revolution to kingdoms. So people began to ask as if Nero was already dethroned, who was to be elected. In everyone's mouth was the name of Rubellius Blandus, who inherited through his mother the high nobility of the Julian family. He was himself attached to the ideas of our ancestors. His manners were austere. His home was one of purity and seclusion, and the more he lived in retirement from fear, the more fame did he acquire. Popular talk was confirmed by an interpretation put with similar credulity on a flash of lightning. While Nero was reclining at dinner in his house named Sublacium on the Cimbrian lake, the table with the banquet was struck and shattered. And as this happened close to Tibur, from which town Plautus derived his origin on his father's side, people believed him to be the man marked out by divine providence, and he was encouraged by that numerous class, whose eager and often mistaken ambition it is to attach themselves prematurely to some new and hazardous cause. This alarmed Nero, and he wrote a letter to Plautus, bidding him consider the tranquility of Rome and withdraw himself from mischievous gossip. He had ancestral possessions in Asia, where he might enjoy his youth safely and quietly, and so thither Plautus retired with his wife Antistia and a few intimate friends. About the same time, an excessive love of luxurious gratification involved Nero in disgrace and danger. He had plunged for a swim into the source of the stream, which Quintus Marcius conveyed to Rome, and it was thought that, by thus immersing his person in it, he had polluted the sacred waters and the sanctity of the spot. A fit of illness which followed convinced people of the divine displeasure. 23. Corbulo, meanwhile, having demolished Artaxata, thought that he ought to avail himself of the recent panic by possessing himself of Tigranocerta, and either by destroying it increase the enemy's terror, or by sparing it win a name for mercy. Thither he marched his army with no hostile demonstrations, lest might cut off all hope of quarter, but still without relaxing his vigilance, knowing as he did the fickle temper of the people, who are as treacherous when they have an opportunity, as they are slow to meet danger. The barbarians, following their individual inclinations, either came to him with entreaties or quitted their villages and dispersed into their deserts. Some there were who hid themselves in caverns with all that they held dearest. The Roman general accordingly dealt variously with them. He was merciful to suppliants, swift in pursuit of fugitives, pitiless towards those who had crept into hiding places, burning them out after filling up the entrances and exits with brushwood and bushes. As he was on his march along the frontier of the Marti, he was incessantly attacked by that tribe which is trained in guerrilla warfare, and defended by mountains against an invader. Corbulo threw the Iberians on them, ravaged their country, and punished the enemies daring at the cost of the blood of the foreigner. 24. Both Corbulo and his army, though suffering no losses in battle, were becoming exhausted by short supplies and hardships, compelled as they were to stave off hunger solely by the flesh of cattle. Added to this was scarcity of water, a burning summer, and long marches, all of which were alleviated only by the general's patient endurance. He bore indeed the same or even more burdens than the common soldier. Subsequently, they reached lands under cultivation and reaped the crops, and of two fortresses in which the Armenians had fled for refuge. One was taken by storm, the other, which repulsed the first attack, was reduced by blockade. Thence the general crossed into the country of the Tauronites, where he escaped an unforeseen peril. Near his tent, a barbarian of no mean rank was discovered with a dagger, who divulged under torture the whole method of the plot, its contrivance by himself and his associates. The men who, under a show of friendship, planned the treachery were convicted and punished. Soon afterwards, Corbulo's envoys, whom he had sent to Tigranocerta, reported that the city walls were open and the inhabitants awaiting orders. They also handed him a gift denoting friendship, a golden crown, which he acknowledged in complimentary language. Nothing was done to humiliate the city, that remaining uninjured it might continue to yield a more cheerful obedience. 25. The citadel, however, which had been closed by an intrepid band of youths, was not stormed without a struggle. They even ventured on an engagement under the walls, but were driven back within their fortifications, and succumbed at last only to our siege works, and to the swords of furious assailants. The success was the easier, as the Parthians were distracted by a war with the Hyrcanians, who had sent to the Roman emperor, imploring alliance and pointing to the fact that they were detaining Valiches as a pledge of amity. When these envoys were on their way home, Corbulo, to save them from being intercepted by the enemy's pickets, after their passage of the Euphrates, gave them an escort and conducted them to the shores of the Red Sea, whence, avoiding Parthian territory, they returned to their native possessions. 26. Corbulo, too, as Tiridates was entering the Armenian frontier through Media, sent on Verilanus, his lieutenant general, with the auxiliaries, while he himself followed with the legions by forced marches, and compelled him to retreat to a distance and abandon the idea of war. Having harried with fire and sword all whom he had ascertained to be against us, he began to take possession of Armenia when Tigrans arrived, whom Nero had selected to assume the sovereignty. Though a Cappadocian noble and grandson of King Archelaus, yet from having long been a hostage at Rome, he had sunk into servile submissiveness, nor was he unanimously welcomed, as some still cherished a liking for the Arsacids. Most, however, in their hatred of Parthian arrogance, preferred a king given them by Rome. He was supported, too, with a force of 1,000 legionaries, 3 allied cohorts, and 2 squadrons of cavalry, that he might the more easily secure his new kingdom. Parts of Armenia, according to their respective proximities, were put under the subjection of Pharasmones, Polemo, Aristobulus, and Antiochus. Corbulo retired into Syria, which province, as being vacant by the death of its governor Ammidius, was entrusted to him. 27. One of the famous cities of Asia, Laodicea, was that same year overthrown by an earthquake, and without any relief from us, recovered itself by its own resources. In Italy, meanwhile, the old town of Puteoli obtained from Nero the privileges of a colony with an additional name. A further enrollment of veterans in Tarentum and Annium did but little for those thinly peopled places, for most scattered themselves in the provinces where they had completed their military service. Not being accustomed to tie themselves by marriage and rear children, they left behind them homes without families, for whole legions were no longer transplanted, as in former days, with tribunes and centurions and soldiers of every grade, so as to form a state by their unity and mutual attachment, but strangers to one another from different companies, without a head or any community of sentiment, were suddenly gathered together as it might be out of any other class of human being, and became a mere crowd rather than a colony. 28. As at the elections for praetors, now generally under the Senate's control, there was the excitement of a particularly keen competition, the emperor quieted matters by promoting the 3 supernumerary candidates to legionary commands. He also raised the dignity of the Senate by deciding that all who appealed from private judges to his house were to incur the same pecuniary risk as those who referred their cause to the emperor. Hitherto, such an appeal had been perfectly open and free from penalty. At the close of the year, Vibius Secundus, a Roman knight on the accusation of the Moors, was convicted of extortion and banished from Italy, contriving through the influence of his brother Vibius Crispus to escape heavier punishment. 29. In the consulship of Caesonius Paetus and Petronius Turpilianus, a serious disaster was sustained in Britain, where Aulus Didius, the emperor's legate, had merely retained our existing possessions, and his successor, Virinius, after having ravaged the Silures in some trifling raids, was prevented by death from extending the war. While he lived, he had a great name for manly independence, though, in his will's final words, he betrayed a flatterer's weakness, for, after heaping adulation on Nero, he added that he should have conquered the province for him, had he lived for the next 2 years. Now, however, Britain was in the hands of Suetonius Paulinus, who in military knowledge and in popular favor, which allows no one to be without a rival, vied with Corbulo and aspired to equal the glory of the recovery of Armenia by the subjugation of Rome's enemies. He therefore prepared to attack the island of Mona, which had a powerful population and was a refuge for fugitives. He built flat-bottomed vessels to cope with the shallows and uncertain depths of the sea. Thus the infantry crossed while the cavalry, followed by fording water was deep, swam by the side of their horses. 30 harrow! On the shore stood the opposing army with its dense array of armed warriors, while between the ranks dashed women in black attire like the Furies, with hair disheveled, waving brands. All around, the Druids, lifting up their cheeks to heaven and pouring forth dreadful imprecations, scared our soldiers by the unfamiliar sight, so that, as if their limbs were paralyzed, they stood motionless and exposed to wounds. Then, urged by their general's appeals and mutual encouragements not to quail before a troop of frenzied women, they bore the standards onwards, smote down all resistance, and wrapped the foe in the flames of his own braids. A force was next set over the conquered, and their groves devoted to inhuman superstitions were destroyed. They deemed it indeed a duty to cover their altars with the blood of captives, and to consult their deities through human entrails. 31. Suetonius, while thus occupied, received tidings of the sudden revolt of the province. Prasutagus, king of the Iceni, famed for his long prosperity, had made the emperor his heir along with his 2 daughters, under the impression that this token of submission would put his kingdom and his house out of the reach of wrong. But the reverse was the result, so much so that his kingdom was plundered by centurions, his house by slaves, as if they were the spoils of war. First his wife Boudica was scourged, and his daughters outraged. All the chief men of the Iceni, as if Rome had received the whole country as a gift, were stripped of their ancestral possessions, and the king's relatives were made slaves, roused by these insults and the dread of worse. Reduced as they now were into the condition of a province, they flew to arms and stirred to revolt the Trinobantes and others who, not yet cowed by slavery, had agreed in secret conspiracy to reclaim their freedom. It was against the veterans that they had the most intense hatred for these new settlers in the colony of Camulodunum drove people out of their houses, ejected them from their farms, called them captives and slaves. And the lawlessness of the veterans was encouraged by the soldiers who lived a similar life and hoped for similar license. A temple also erected to the divine Claudius was ever before their eyes, a citadel, as it seemed, of perpetual tyranny. Men chosen as priests had to squander their whole fortunes under the pretense of a religious ceremonial. It appeared, too, no difficult matter to destroy the colony, undefended as it was by fortifications, a precaution neglected by our generals, while they thought more of what was agreeable than of what was agreeable. 32. Meanwhile, without any evident cause, the statue of victory at Camulodunum fell prostrate and turned its back to the enemy, as though it fled before them. Women excited to frenzy prophesied impending destruction, ravings in a strange tongue. Ravings in a strange tongue, it was said, were heard in their senate house, their theater resounded with wailings, and in the estuary of the Temasa had been seen the appearance of an overthrown town. Even the ocean had worn the aspect of blood, and when the tide ebbed, there had been left the likenesses of human forms, marvels interpreted by the Britons as hopeful, by the veterans as alarming. But as Suetonius was far away, they implored aid from the procurator Catus Decianus. All he did was to send 200 men and no more without regular arms, and there was in the place but a small military force. Trusting to the protection of the temple, hindered too by secret accomplices in the revolt, who embarrassed their plans, they had constructed neither fosse nor rampart, nor had they removed their old men and women, leaving their youth alone to face the foe. Surprised, as it were, in the midst of peace, they were surrounded by an immense host of the barbarians. All else was plundered or fired in the onslaught. The temple where the soldiers had assembled was stormed after a 2-days' siege. The victorious enemy met Petilius Cerealis, commander of the 9th Legion. As he was coming to the rescue, routed his troops, and destroyed all his infantry. Cerealis escaped with some cavalry into the camp, and was saved by its fortifications. Alarmed by this disaster, and by the fury of the province which he had goaded into war by his rapacity, the procurator Catus crossed over into Gaul. 33. Suetonius, however, with wonderful resolution, marched amidst a hostile population to Londinium, which, though undistinguished by the name of a colony, was much frequented by a number of merchants and trading vessels. Uncertain whether he should choose it as a seat of war, as he looked round on his scanty force of soldiers, and remembered with what a serious warning the rashness of Petilius had been punished, he resolved to save the province at the cost of a single town. Nor did the tears and weeping of the people, as they implored his aid, deter him from giving the signal of departure and receiving into his army all who would go with him. Those who were chained to the spot by the weakness of their sex, or the infirmity of age, or the attractions of the place, were cut off by the enemy. Like ruin fell on the town of Verulamium for the barbarians, who delighted in plunder and were indifferent to all else, passed by the fortresses with military garrisons, and attacked whatever offered most wealth to the spoiler, and was unsafe for defense. About 70,000 citizens and allies, it appeared, fell in the places which I had mentioned, for it was not on making prisoners and selling them, or on any of the barter of war, that the enemy was bent, but on slaughter on the gibbet. The fire and the cross, like men soon about to pay the penalty, and meanwhile snatching at instant vengeance. 34. Suetonius had the 14th legion with the veterans of the 20th, and auxiliaries from the neighborhood, to the number of about 10,000 armed men, when he prepared to break off delay and fight a battle. He chose a position approached by a narrow defile, closed in at the rear by a forest, having first ascertained that there was not a soldier of the enemy, except in his front, where an open plain extended without any danger from ambuscades. His legions were in close array, round them the light-armed troops, and the cavalry in dense array on the wings. On the other side, the army of the Britons, with its masses of infantry, was confidently exulting. A vaster host than ever had assembled, and so fierce in spirit that they actually brought with them, to witness the victory, their wives riding in wagons, which they had placed on the extreme border of the plain. 35. Boudicca, with her daughters before her in a chariot, went up to tribe after tribe, protesting that it was indeed usual for Britons to fight under the leadership of women. But now, she said, it is not as a woman descended from noble ancestry, but as one of the people that I am avenging lost freedom, my scourged body, the outraged chastity of my daughters. Roman lust has gone so far that not our very persons, nor even age or virginity, are left unpolluted. But heaven is on the side of a righteous vengeance. A legion which dared to fight has perished. The rest are hiding themselves in their camp, or are thinking anxiously of flight. They will not sustain even the din and the shout of so many thousands, much less our charge and our blows. If you weigh well the strength of the armies and the causes of the war, you will see that in this battle you must conquer or die. This is a woman's resolve. As for men, they may live and be slaves. 36. Nor was Suetonius silent at such a crisis. Though he confided in the valor of his men, he yet mingled encouragements and entreaties to disdain the clamors and empty threats of the barbarians. There, he said, you see more women than warriors. Unwarlike, unarmed, they will give way the moment they have recognized that sword and that courage of their conquerors, which have so often routed them. Even among many legions, it is a few who really decide the battle, and it will enhance their glory that a small force should earn the renown of an entire army. Only close up the ranks, and having discharged your javelins, then with shields and swords continue the work of bloodshed and destruction, without a thought of plunder. When once the victory has been won, everything will be in your power. Such was the enthusiasm which followed the general's address, and so promptly did the veteran soldiery, with their long experience of battles, prepare for the hurling of the javelin, that it was with confidence in the result that Suetonius gave the signal of battle. 37. At first, the legion kept its position, clinging to the narrow defile as a defense. When they had exhausted their missiles, which they discharged with unerring aim on the closely approaching foe, they rushed out in a wedge-like column. Similar was the onset of the auxiliaries, while the cavalry with extended lances broke through all who offered a strong resistance. The rest turned their back in flight, and flight proved difficult because the surrounding wagons had blocked retreat. Our soldiers spared not to slay even the women, while the very beasts of burden, transfixed by the missiles, swelled the piles of bodies. Great glory equal to that of our old victories was won on that day. Some indeed say that there fell little less than 80,000 of the Britons, with a loss to our soldiers of about 400, and only as many wounded. Boudicca put an end to her life by poison. Punius Postumus, too, camp prefect of the 2nd Legion, when he knew of the success of the men of the 14th and 20th, feeling that he had cheated his legion out of like glory, and had, contrary to all military usage, disregarded the general's orders, threw himself on his sword. 38. The whole army was then brought together and kept under canvas to finish the remainder of the war. The emperor strengthened the forces by sending from Germany 2,000 legionaries, 8 cohorts of auxiliaries, and 1,000 cavalry. On their arrival, the men of the 9th had their number made up with legionary soldiers. The allied infantry and cavalry were placed in new winter quarters, and whatever tribes still wavered or were hostile were ravaged with fire and sword. Nothing, however, distressed the enemy so much as famine, for they had been careless about sowing corn, people of every age having gone to the war, while they reckoned on our supplies as their own, nations too. So high-spirited inclined the more slowly to peace because Julius Classicanus, who had been sent as successor to Catus and was at variance with Suetonius, let private animosities interfere with the public interest, and had spread an idea that they ought to wait for a new governor who, having neither the anger of an enemy nor the pride of a conqueror, would deal mercifully with those who had surrendered. At the same time, he stated in a dispatch to Rome that no cessation of fighting must be expected unless Suetonius were superseded, attributing that general's disasters to perverseness and his successes to good luck. 39. Accordingly, one of the imperial freedmen, Polyclitus, was sent to survey the state of Britain, Nero having great hopes that his influence would be able not only to establish a good understanding between the governor and the procurator, but also to pacify the rebellious spirit of the barbarians. And Polyclitus, who with his enormous suite had been a burden to Italy and Gaul, failed not, as soon as he had crossed said the ocean, to make his progresses a terror even to our soldiers. But to the enemy he was a laughing stock, for they still retained some of the fire of liberty, knowing nothing yet of the power of freedmen. And so they marveled to see a general and an army who had finished such a war cringing to slaves. Everything, however, was softened down for the emperor's ears, and Suetonius was retained in the government. But as he subsequently lost a few vessels on the shore with the crews, he was ordered, as though the war continued, to hand over his army to Petronius Turpilianus, who had just resigned his consulship. Petronius neither challenged the enemy nor was himself molested, and veiled this tame inaction under the honorable name of peace. That same year 2 remarkable crimes were committed at Rome, one by a senator, the other by the daring of a slave. Domitius Balbus, an ex-praetor from his prolonged old age, his childlessness, and his wealth, was exposed to many a plot. His kinsman Valerius Fabianus, who was marked out for a career of promotion, forged a will in his name with Venetius Rufinus and Terentius Lentinus Roman knights for his accomplices. These men had associated with them Antonius Primus and Asinius Marcellus. Antonius was a man of ready audacity. Marcellus had the glory of being the great-grandson of Asinius Pollio, and bore a character far from contemptible, except that he thought poverty the greatest of all evils. So Fabianus, with the persons whom I have named, and some others less distinguished, executed the will. The crime was proved against them before the Senate, and Fabianus and Antonius, with Rufinus and Terentius, were condemned under the Cornelian law. Marcellus was saved from punishment rather than from disgrace by the memory of his ancestors and the intercessions of the emperor. 41. That same day was fatal also to Pompeius Aelianus, a young ex-quaestor suspected of complicity in the villainies of Fabianus. He was outlawed from Italy and from Spain, where he was born. Valerius Pontius suffered the same degradation for having indicted the defendants before the praetor to save them from being prosecuted in the court of the city prefect, purposing meanwhile to defeat justice on some legal pretext and subsequently by collusion. A clause was added to the Senate's decree that whoever bought or sold such a service was to be just as liable to punishment as if he had been publicly convicted of false accusation. 42. Soon afterwards, one of his own slaves murdered the city prefect, Pedanius Secundus, either because he had been refused his freedom, for which he had made a bargain, or in the jealousy of a love in which he could not brook his master's rivalry. Ancient custom required that the whole slave establishment, which had dwelt under the same roof, should be dragged to execution, when a sudden gathering of the populace, which was for saving so many innocent lives, brought matters to actual insurrection. Even in the Senate there was a strong feeling on the part of those who shrank from extreme rigor, though the majority were opposed to any innovation. Of these, Caius Cassius, in giving his vote, argued to the following effect. 43. Often have I been present, senators, in this assembly when new decrees were demanded from us contrary to the customs and laws of our ancestors, and I have refrained from opposition, not because I doubted, but that in all matters the arrangements of the past were better and fairer, and that all changes were for the worse. But that might not seem to be exalting my own profession out of an excessive partiality for ancient precedent. At the same time, I thought that any influence I possess ought not to be destroyed by incessant protests, wishing that it might remain unimpaired, should the state ever need my counsels. Today this has come to pass. Since an ex-consul has been murdered in his house by the treachery of slaves, which not one hindered or divulged, though the Senate's decree, which threatens the entire slave establishment with execution, has been till now unshaken. Vote impunity in heaven's name, and then who will be protected by his rank when the prefecture of the capital has been of no avail to its holder? Who will be kept safe by the number of his slaves when 400 have not protected Pedanius Secundus? Which of us will be rescued by his domestics, who, even with the dread of punishment before them, regard not our dangers? Was the murderer, as some do not blush to pretend, avenging his wrongs because he had bargained about money from his father, or because a family slave was taken from him? Let us actually decide that the master was justly slain. 44. Is it your pleasure to search for arguments in a matter already weighed in the deliberations of wiser men than ourselves? Even if we had now for the first time to come to a decision, do you believe that a slave took courage to murder his master without letting fall a threatening word or uttering a rash syllable? Granted that he concealed his purpose, that he procured his weapon without his fellow's knowledge. Could he pass the night guard? Could he open the doors of the chamber, carry in a light, and accomplish the murder while all were in ignorance? There are many preliminaries to guilt. If these are divulged by slaves, we may live singly amid numbers, safe among a trembling throng. Lastly, if we must perish in vengeance on the guilt. Our ancestors always suspected the temper of their slaves, even when they were born on the same estates, or in the same houses with themselves, and thus inherited from their birth an affection for their masters. But now that we have in our households nations with different customs to our own, with a foreign worship, or none at all, it is only by terror you can hold in such a motley rabble. But it will be said the innocent will perish. Well, even in a beaten army, when every 10th man is felled by the club, the lot falls also on the brave. There is some injustice in every great precedent which, though injurious to individuals, has its compensation in the public advantage. 45:5. No one indeed dared singly to oppose the opinion of Cassius, but clamorous voices rose in reply from all who pitied the number, age, or sex, as well as the undoubted innocence of the great majority. Still, the party which voted for their execution prevailed, but the sentence could not be obeyed in the face of a dense and threatening mob with stones and firebrands. Then the emperor reprimanded the people by edict, and lined with a force of soldiers the entire route by which the condemned had to be dragged to execution. Cingonius Varro had proposed that even all the freedmen under the same roof should be transported from Italy. This the emperor forbade, as he did not wish an ancient custom, which mercy had not relaxed, to be strained with cruel rigor. 46. During the same consulship, Tarquinius Priscus was convicted of extortion on the prosecution of the Bithynians, to the great joy of the senators, who remembered that he had impeached Statilius, his own proconsul. An assessment was made of Gaul by Quintus Volusius Sextius Africanus and Trebellius Maximus. There was a rivalry on the score of rank between Volusius and Africanus. While they both disdained Trebellius, they raised him above themselves. 47. In that year died Memmius Regulus, who from his solid worth and consistency was as distinguished as it is possible to be under the shadow of an emperor's grandeur, so much so, in fact, that Nero, when he was ill, with flatterers round him who said that if aught befell him in the course of destiny, there must be an end of the empire, replied that the state had a resource, and on their asking where it was specially to be found, he added, in Memmius Regulus. Yet Regulus lived after this, protected by his retiring habits, and by the fact that he was a man of newly risen family and of wealth which did not provoke envy. Nero, the same year, established a gymnasium where oil was furnished to knights and senators, after the lax fashion of the Greeks. 48. In the consulship of Publius Marius and Lucius Asinius Antistius, the praetor, whose lawless behavior as tribune of the people I have mentioned, composed some libellous verses on the emperor, which he openly recited at a large gathering when he was dining at the house of Osturus Capula. He was upon this impeached of high treason by Cosigianus Capito, who had lately been restored to a senator's rank on the intercession of his father-in-law. Tigellinus, this was the first occasion on which the law of treason was revived, and men thought that it was not so much the ruin of Antistius, which was aimed at, as the glory of the emperor, whose veto as tribune might save from death one whom the Senate had condemned. Though Ostorius had stated that he had heard nothing as evidence, the adverse witnesses were believed, and Junius Marulus, consul-elect, proposed that the accused should be deprived of his praetorship and be put to death in the ancient manner. The rest assented, and then Paetus Therezea, after much eulogy of Caesar and most bitter censure of Antistius, argued that it was not what a guilty prisoner might deserve to suffer, which ought to be decreed against him under so excellent a prince. And by a senate, bound by no compulsion, the executioner and the halter, he said, we have long ago abolished. Still there are punishments ordained by the laws, which prescribe penalties without judicial cruelty and disgrace to our age. Rather send him to some island after confiscating his property. There, the longer he drags on his guilty life, the more wretched will he be personally, and the more conspicuous as an example of public clemency. 49. Therese's free-spokenness broke through the servility of the other senators. As soon as the consul out of division, they voted with him, with but few exceptions. Among these, the most enthusiastic in his flattery was Aulus Vitellius, who attacked all the best men with abuse, and was silent when they replied, the usual way of a cowardly temper. The consuls, however, did not dare to ratify the Senate's vote, and simply communicated their unanimous resolution to the emperor. Hesitating for a while between shame and rage, he at last wrote to them, in reply that Antistius, without having been provoked by any wrong, had uttered outrageous insults against the sovereign, that a demand for punishment had been submitted to the Senate, and that it was right that a penalty should be decreed proportioned to the offense. That for himself, inasmuch as he would have opposed severity in the sentence, he would not be an obstacle to leniency. They might determine as they pleased, and they had free liberty to acquit. This and more to the same effect having been read out. Clearly showing his displeasure, the consuls did not for that reason alter the terms of the motion, nor did Thrasea withdraw his proposal, or the Senate reject what it had once approved. Some were afraid of seeming to expose the emperor to odium. The majority felt safe in numbers, while Thrasea was supported by his usual firmness of spirit and a determination not to let his fame perish. 50. A similar accusation caused the downfall of Fabricius Veienta, though he had composed many libels on senators and pontiffs in a work to which he gave the title of codicils. Tallius Geminus, the prosecutor, further stated that he had habitually trafficked in the emperor's favors and in the right of promotion. This was Nero's reason for himself undertaking the trial, and having convicted Veiento, he banished him from Italy and ordered the burning of his books, which, while it was dangerous to procure them, were anxiously sought and much read. Soon full freedom for their possession caused their oblivion. 51. But while the miseries of the state were daily growing worse, its supports were becoming weaker. Burrus died. Whether from illness or from poison was a question. It was supposed to be illness from the fact that, from the gradual swelling of his throat inwardly, and the closing up of the passage, he ceased to breathe. Many positively asserted that by Nero's order his throat was smeared with some poisonous drug under the pretense of the application of a remedy, and that Burrus, who saw through the crime when the emperor paid him a visit, recoiled with horror from his gaze, and merely replied to his question, "I indeed am well." Rome felt for him a deep and lasting regret, because of the remembrance of his worth, because too of the merely passive virtue of one of his successors and the very flagrant iniquities of the other. For the emperor had appointed 2 men to the command of the Praetorian cohorts, Vaninius Rufus, for a vulgar popularity, which he owed to his administration of the corn supplies without profit to himself, and Sophonius Tigellinus, whose inveterate shamelessness and infamy were an attraction to him, as might have been expected from their known characters. Tigellinus had the greater influence with the prince, and was the associate of his most secret profligacy, while Rufus enjoyed the favor of the people and of the soldiers, and this he found prejudiced him with Nero. 52. The death of Burrus was a blow to Seneca's power, for virtue had not the same strength when one of its companions, so to say, was removed. And Nero too began to lean on worse advisers. They assailed Seneca with various charges, representing that he continued to increase a wealth which was already so vast as to be beyond the scale of a subject, and was drawing to himself the attachment of the citizens. While in the picturesqueness of his gardens and the magnificence of his country houses, he almost surpassed the emperor. They further alleged against him that he claimed for himself alone the honors of eloquence, and composed poetry more assiduously, as soon as a passion for it had seized on Nero. Openly inimical to the prince's amusements, he disparaged his ability in driving horses and ridiculed his voice whenever he sang. When was there to be an end of nothing being publicly admired but what Seneca was thought to have originated? Surely Nero's boyhood was over, and he was all but in the prime of youthful manhood. He ought to shake off a tutor, furnished as he was with sufficiently noble instructors in his own ancestors. 53. Seneca, meanwhile, aware of these slanders, which were revealed to him by those who had some respect for merit, coupled with the fact that the emperor more and more shunned his intimacy, besought the opportunity of an interview. This was granted, and he spoke as follows: "It is 14 years ago, Caesar, that I was first associated with your prospects, and 8 years since you have been emperor. In the interval you have heaped on me such honors and riches that nothing is wanting to my happiness but a right use of it. I will refer to G-rate examples taken not from my own, but from your position. Your great-grandfather Augustus granted to Marcus Agrippa the calm repose of Mitylene, to Caius Maecenas what was nearly equivalent to a foreign retreat in the capital itself. One of these men shared his wars. The other struggled with many laborious duties at Rome. Both received awards which were indeed splendid, but only proportioned to their great merits. For myself, what other recompense had I for your munificence than a culture nursed, so to speak, in the shade of retirement, and to which a glory attaches itself, because I thus seem to have helped on the early training of your youth, an ample reward for the service. You, on the other hand, have surrounded me with vast influence and boundless wealth, so that I often think within myself, am I, who am but of an equestrian and provincial family, numbered among the chief men of Rome? Among nobles who can show a long succession of glories, has my new name become famous? Where is the mind once content with a humble lot? Is this the man who is building up his garden terraces, who paces grandly through these suburban parks, and revels in the affluence of such broad lands and such widely spread investments? Only one apology occurs to me, that it would not have been right in me to have thwarted your bounty. 54. And yet we have both filled up our respective measures, you in giving as much as a prince can bestow on a friend, and I in receiving as much as a friend can receive from a prince. All else only fosters envy, which, like all things human, sinks powerless beneath your greatness, though on me it weighs heavily. To me relief is a necessity, just as I should implore support if exhausted by warfare or travel. So, in this journey of life, old as I am, and unequal even to the lightest cares, since I cannot any longer bear the burden of my wealth, I crave assistance. Order my property to be managed by your agents and to be included in your estate. Still, I shall not sink myself into poverty, but having surrendered the splendors which dazzle me, I will henceforth again devote to my mind all the leisure and attention now reserved for my gardens and country houses. You have yet before you a vigorous prime, and that on which for so many years your eyes were fixed, supreme power. We, your older friends, can answer for our quiet behavior. It will likewise redound to your honor that you have raised to the highest places men who could also bear moderate fortune 55 times. Nero's reply was substantially this: my being able to meet your elaborate speech with an instant rejoinder is, I consider, primarily your gift, for you taught me how to express myself not only after reflection, but at a moment's notice. My great-grandfather Augustus allowed Agrippa and Maecenas to enjoy rest after their labors, but he did it at an age carrying with it an authority sufficient to justify any boon of any sort he might have bestowed. But neither of them did he strip of the rewards he had given. It was by war and its perils they had earned them, for in these the youth of Augustus was spent, and if I had passed my years in arms, your sword and right hand would not have failed me. But as my actual condition required, you watched over my boyhood, then over my youth, with wisdom, counsel, and advice. And indeed your gifts to me will, as long as life holds out, be lasting possessions. Those which you owe to me, your parks, investments, your country houses, are liable to accidents. Though they seem much, many far inferior to you in merit have obtained more. I am ashamed to quote the names of freedmen who parade a greater wealth. Hence, I actually blush to think that, standing as you do first in my affections, you do not as yet surpass all in fortune 56. Yours too is a still vigorous manhood, quite equal to the labors of business, and to the fruit of those labors. And, as for myself, I am but treading the threshold of empire. But perhaps you count yourself inferior to Vitellius, thrice a consul, and me a Claudius. Such wealth as long thrift has procured for Volusius my bounty, you think, cannot fully make up to you. Why not rather, if the frailty of my youth goes in any respect astray, call me back and guide yet more zealously with your help the manhood which you have instructed? It will not be your moderation if you restore me your wealth, not your love of quiet, if you forsake your emperor, but my avarice, the fear of my cruelty, which will be in all men's mouths, even if your self-control were praised to the utmost. Still, it would not be seemly in a wise man to get glory for himself in the very act of bringing disgrace on his friend. To these words the emperor added embraces and kisses, for he was formed by nature and trained by habit to veil his hatred under delusive flattery. Seneca thanked him, the usual end of an interview with a despot. But he entirely altered the practices of his former greatness. He kept the crowds of his visitors at a distance, avoided trains of followers, seldom appeared in Rome, as though weak health or philosophical studies detained him at home. 57. When Seneca had fallen, it was easy to shake the position of Fannius Rufus by making Agrippina's friendship a charge against him. To Gellinus, who was daily becoming more powerful, and who thought that the wicked schemings which alone gave him strength would be better liked if he could secure the emperor's complicity in guilt, dived into Nero's most secret apprehensions, and, as soon as he had ascertained that Plautus and Sulla were the men he most dreaded, Plautus having been lately sent away to Asia, Sulla to Gallia Narbonensis, he spoke much of their noble rank, and of their respective proximity to the armies of the East and of Germany. I have no eye, he said, like Burrus, to two conflicting aims, but only to Nero's safety, which is at least secured against treachery in Rome by my presence. As for distant commotions, how can they be checked? Gaul is roused at the name of the great dictator, and I distrust no less the nations of Asia, because of the renown of such a grandfather as Drusus. Sulla is poor, and hence comes his surpassing audacity. He shams apathy, while he is seeking an opening for his reckless ambition. Plautus, again with his great wealth, does not so much as affect a love of repose, but he flaunts before us his imitations of the old Romans, and assumes the self-consciousness of the Stoics, along with a philosophy which makes men restless and eager for a busy life. There is not a moment's delay. Sulla, 6 days afterwards was murdered by assassins brought over to Massilia, while he was reclining at the dinner table before he feared or heard of his danger. The head was taken to Rome, and Nero scoffed at its premature gray hairs as if they were a disfigurement. 58. It was less of a secret that there was a design to murder Plautus, as his life was dear to many, the distance too by land and sea. And the interval of time had given rise to rumors, and the popular story was that he had tampered with Corbulo, who was then at the head of great armies, and would be a special mark for danger if illustrious and innocent men were to be destroyed. Again, Asia, it was said, from his partiality for the young man, had taken up arms, and the soldiers sent to do the crime, not being sufficient in number or decided in purpose, and finding themselves unable to execute their orders, had gone over to the new cause. These absurdities, like all popular gossip, gathered strength from the idle leisure of a credulous society. As it was, one of Plautus's freedmen, thanks to swift winds, arrived before the centurion and brought him a message from his father-in-law, Lucius Antistius. He was to avoid the obvious refuge of a coward's death, and in the pity felt for a noble name, he would soon find good men to help him, and daring spirits would rally round him. Meantime, no resource was to be rejected. If he did but repel 60 soldiers, this was the number on the way, while tidings were being carried back to Nero, while another force was on its march, many events would follow, which would ripen into war. Finally, by this plan, he either secured safety, or he would suffer nothing worse by daring than by cowardice. 59. But all this had no effect on Plautus. Either he saw no resource before him, an unarmed exile as he was, or he was weary of an uncertain hope, or was swayed by his love of his wife and of his children, to whom he thought the emperor, if harassed by no anxiety, would be more merciful. Some say that another message came to him from his father-in-law, representing that no dreadful peril hung over him, and that 2 teachers of philosophy, Coeranus from Greece and Musonius from Etruria, advised him to await death with firmness rather than lead a precarious and anxious life. At all events, he was surprised at midday when stripped for exercise. In that state, the centurion slew him in the presence of Pelago, an eunuch, whom Nero had set over the centurion and his company, like a despot's minister over his satellites. The head of the murdered man was brought to help. At its sight, the emperor exclaimed, I give his very words, "Why would you have been a Nero?" Then, casting off all fear, he prepared to hurry on his marriage with Poppaea, hitherto deferred because of such alarms as I have described, and to divorce his wife Octavia, notwithstanding her virtuous life, because her father's name, and the people's affection for her, made her an offense to him. He wrote, however, a letter to the Senate, confessing nothing about the murders of Sulla and Plautus, but merely hinting that both had a restless temper, and that he gave the most anxious thought to the safety of the state. On this pretext, a thanksgiving was decreed, and also the expulsion from the Senate of Sulla and Plautus, more grievous, however, as a farce than as an actual calamity. 60. Nero, on receiving this decree of the Senate, and seeing that every piece of his wickedness was regarded as a conspicuous merit, drove Octavia from him, alleging that she was barren, and then married Poppy, the woman who had long been Nero's mistress, and ruled him first as a paramour, then as her husband, instigated one of Octavia's servants to accuse her an intrigue with a slave. The man fixed on as the guilty lover was one by name Eucharis, an Alexandrian by birth, skilled in singing to the flute. As a consequence, her slave girls were examined under torture, and though some were forced by the intensity of agony into admitting falsehoods, most of them persisted in upholding the virtue of their mistress. One of them said, in answer to the furious menaces of Tigellinus, that Octavia's person was purer than his mouth. Octavia, however, was dismissed under the form of an ordinary divorce, and received possession of the house of Burrus and of the estates of Plautus. An ill-starred gift, she was soon afterwards banished to Campania under military surveillance. This led to incessant and outspoken remonstrances among the common people, who have less discretion, and are exposed to fewer dangers than others from the insignificance of their position. Upon this, Nero, though he did not repent of his outrage, restored to Octavia her position as wife. 61. Then people in their joy went up to the Capitol, and at last gave thanks to the gods. They threw down the statues of Papatia. They bore on their shoulders the images of Octavia, covering them with flowers, and setting them up in the forum and in the temples. There was even a burst of applause for the emperor, men hailing the recalled Octavia. And now they were pouring into the palace in crowds, with loud shoutings, when some companies of soldiers rushed out and dispersed the tumultuous throng with blows. And at the point of the sword, whatever changes had been made in the riot were reversed, and Papia's honors restored. Ever relentless in our hatred, she was now enraged by the fear that either the violence of the mob would burst on her with yet fiercer fury, or that Nero would be swayed by the popular bias, and so, flinging herself at his knees, she exclaimed that she was not in the position of a rival fighting for marriage, though that was dearer to her than life, but that her very life was brought into jeopardy by the dependents and slaves of Octavia, who had assumed the name of the people and dared in peace what could hardly happen in war. Those arms, she said, have been taken up against the emperor. A leader only is wanting, and he will easily be found in a commotion. Only let her whose mere beck, though she is far away, stirs up tumult, quit Campania, and make her way in person to Rome. And again, what is my sin? What offense have I caused anyone? Is it that I am about to give to the house of the Caesars a lawful heir? Do the people of Rome prefer that the offspring of an Egyptian flute player should be raised to the imperial throne? In a word, if it be expedient, Nero should of his own choice, rather than on compulsion, send for her who ruled him, or else secure his safety by a righteous vengeance. The beginning of a commotion has often been quieted by slight precautions, but if people once despair of Octavia being Nero's wife, they will soon find her a husband. 62. Her various arguments, tending both to frighten and to enrage, at once alarmed and incensed her listener. But the suspicion about the slave was of little weight, and the torture of the slave girls exposed its absurdity. Consequently, it was decided to procure a confession from someone on whom could also be fastened a charge of revolutionary designs. Fittest for this seemed the perpetrator of the mother's murder and Tacitus' commander, as I have already mentioned, of the fleet at Misenum, who got but scant gratitude after that atrocious deed, and subsequently all the more vehement hatred, inasmuch as men look on their instruments in crime as a sort of standing reproach to them. The emperor accordingly sent for Tacitus and reminded him of his former service. He alone, he said, had come to the rescue of the prince's life against a plotting mother. Close at hand was a chance of winning no less gratitude by ridding him of a malignant wife. No violence or weapons were needed, only let him confess to an intrigue with Octavia. Nero then promised him a secret but ample immediate recompense and some delightful retreat, while he threatened him with death in case of refusal. Tacitus, with the moral insensibility of his nature and a promptness inspired by previous atrocities, invented even more than was required of him, and confessed before friends, whom the prince had called in, as a sort of judicial council. He was then banished to Sardinia, where he endured exile without poverty and died a natural death. 63 Nero. Nero, meanwhile, declared by edict that the prefect had been corrupted into a design of gaining over the flow, and added, in forgetfulness of his late charge of barrenness against Octavia, that conscious of her profligacies, she had procured abortion, a fact he had himself ascertained. Then he confined her in the island of Pandataria. No exile ever filled the eyes of beholders with tears of greater compassion. Some still remembered Agrippina, banished by Tiberius, and the yet fresher memory of Julia, whom Claudius exiled, was present to men's thoughts. But they had life's prime for their stay. They had seen some happiness, and the horror of the moment was alleviated by recollections of a better lot in the past. For Octavia, from the first, her marriage day was a kind of funeral brought, as she was, into a house where she had nothing but scenes of mourning, her father and an instant afterwards her brother having been snatched from her by poison, then a slave girl raised above the mistress. Poppaea married only to ensure a wife's ruin, and to end all an accusation more horrible than any death. 64. And now the girl, in her 20th year, with centurions and soldiers around her, already removed from among the living by the forecast of doom, still could not reconcile herself to death. After an interval of a few days, she received an order that she was to die, although she protested that she was now a widow and only a sister, and appealed to their common ancestors, the Germanici, and finally to the name of Agrippina, during whose life she had endured a marriage, which was miserable enough indeed, but not fatal. She was then tightly bound with cords, and the veins of every limb were opened. But as her blood was congealed by terror and flowed too slowly, she was killed outright by the steam of an intensely hot bath. To this was added the yet more appalling horror of Poppaea beholding the severed head which was conveyed to Rome, and for all this offerings were voted to the temples. I record the fact with a special object. Whoever would study the calamities of that period in my pages, or those of other authors, is to take it for granted that as often as the emperor directed banishments or executions, so often was there a thanksgiving to the gods. And what formerly commemorated some prosperous event was then a token of public disaster. Still, if any decree of the Senate was marked by some new flattery, or by the lowest servility, I shall not pass it over in silence. 65. That same year Nero was believed to have destroyed by poison 2 of his most powerful freedmen, Doryphorus, on the pretext of his having opposed the marriage with Poppaea, Pallas for still keeping his boundless wealth by a prolonged old age. Romanus had accused Seneca in stealthy calumnies of having been an accomplice of Caius Piso, but he was himself crushed more effectually by Seneca on the same charge. This alarmed Piso, and gave rise to a huge fabric of unsuccessful conspiracies against Nero. Book 15 warned. Meanwhile, the Parthian king, Vologeses, when he heard of Corbulo's achievements and of a foreign prince, Tigranes, having been set over Armenia, though he longed at the same time to avenge the majesty of the Arsacids, which had been insulted by the expulsion of his brother Tiridates, was on the other hand drawn to different thoughts as he reflected on the greatness of Rome, and felt reverence for a hitherto unbroken treaty. Naturally irresolute, he was now hampered by a revolt of the Hyrcanians, a powerful tribe, and by several wars arising out of it. Suddenly, as he was wavering, fresh and further tidings of disgrace goaded him to action. Tigranes, quitting Armenia, had ravaged the Adiabeni, a people on its border, too extensively and continuously for mere plundering raids. The chief men of the tribes were indignant at having fallen into such contempt that they were victims to the inroads, not indeed of a Roman general, but of a daring hostage who for so many years had been numbered among slaves. Their anger was inflamed by Monobazus, who ruled the Adiabeni and repeatedly asked what protection he was to seek, and from what quarter already, he said, Armenia has been given up and its borders are being wrested from us. And unless the Parthians help us, we shall find that subjection to Rome is lighter for those who surrender than for the conquered. Tiridates, too, exile as he was from his kingdom, by his silence or very moderate complaints made the deeper impression. It is not, he urged, by weak inaction that great empires are held together. There must be the struggle of brave men in arms. Might is right with those who are at the summit of power. And though it is the glory of a private house to keep its own, it is the glory of a king to fight for the possessions of others. Too moved by these considerations, Vologeses called a council, placed Tiridates by his side, and began to speak as follows. This man before you, born from the same father as myself, having waived in my favor on the ground of age, the highest title of all, was established by me in the possession of Armenia, which is accounted the third grade of power. As for Media, Pacorus was already in possession of it, and I thought to myself that I had duly arranged our family and home so as to guard against the old feuds and rivalries of brothers. The Romans thwart me, and though they have never with success to themselves disturbed the peace between us, they are now again breaking it to their own destruction. I will not attempt to deny one thing. It was by just dealing rather than by bloodshed, by having a good cause rather than by arms, that I had wished to retain what my ancestors had won. If I have sinned through irresolution, my valor shall make amends for it. Assuredly your strength and renown are at their height, and you have in addition the repute of obedience, which the greatest of mortals must not despise, and which the gods highly esteem. As he spoke, he encircled Tiridates' brow with a diadem. And to Manus a noble he entrusted a highly efficient body of cavalry, which was the king's customary escort, giving him also some auxiliaries from the Adiabani, and orders that Tigranes was to be driven out of Armenia. He would himself abandon his feud with the Hyrcanians, and raise his own national force, in all its warlike strength, by way of menace to the Roman provinces. 3. When Corbulo had heard all this from messengers he could trust, he sent 2 legions under Verilanus, Severus, and Vettius Bolanus to the support of Tigranes, with secret instructions that they were to conduct all their operations with deliberation rather than dispatch, as he would prefer to sustain rather than to make war. And indeed he had written to the emperor that a general was wanted specially for the defense of Armenia, and that Syria, threatened as it was by Vologeses, was in yet more imminent peril. Meanwhile he posted his remaining legions on the bank of the Euphrates, armed a hastily collected force of provincials, and occupied with troops the enemy's approaches. And as the country was deficient in water, he established forts to guard the wells, and concealed some of the streams with heaps of sand for. While Corbulo was thus preparing for the defense of Syria, Mons rapidly pushed on his forces to anticipate the rumor of his advance, but he did not any the more find Tigranes unaware of or unprepared for his movement. He had, in fact, occupied Tigranocerta, a city strong from the multitude of its defenders and the vastness of its fortifications. In addition, the river Nicephorus, the breadth of which is far from contemptible, circled a portion of its walls, and a wide fosse was drawn, where they distrusted the protection of the stream. There were some soldiers, too, and supplies previously provided. In the conveyance of these a few men had hurried on too eagerly, and having been surprised by a sudden attack from the enemy, had inspired their comrades with rage rather than fear. But the Parthian has not the daring in close combat needed for a successful siege. His thin showers of arrows do not alarm men within walls, and only disappoint himself. The Adiabani, when they began to advance their scaling ladders and engines, were easily driven back and then cut down by a sally of our men. Corbulo, however, notwithstanding his successes, thought he must use his good fortune with moderation, and sent Vologeses a message of remonstrance against the violence done to a Roman province, and the blockade of an allied and friendly king and of Roman cohorts. He had better give up the siege, or he, Corbulo too, would encamp in his territory. As on hostile ground, Casperius, a centurion selected for this mission, had an interview with the king at the town Nisibis, 37 miles distant from Tigranocerta, and with fearless spirit announced his message. With Vologeses, it was an old and deep conviction that he should shun the arms of Rome, nor was the present going smoothly with him. The siege was a failure. Tigranes was safe with his troops and supplies. Those who had undertaken the storming of the place had been routed, legions had been sent into Armenia, and other legions were ready to rush to the attack on behalf of Syria, while his own cavalry was crippled by want of food. A host of locusts, suddenly appearing, had devoured every blade of grass and every leaf. And so, hiding his fear and presenting a more conciliatory attitude, he replied that he would send envoys to the Roman emperor for the possession of Armenia and the conclusion of a lasting peace. He ordered Mons to leave Tigranocerta, while he himself retired. 6. Many spoke highly of these results, as due to the king's alarm and the threats of Corbulo, and as splendid successes. Others explained them as a secret understanding that with the cessation of war on both sides and the departure of Vologeses, Tigranes also was to quit Armenia. Why, it was asked, had the Roman army been withdrawn from Tigranocerta? Why had they abandoned in peace what they had defended in war? Was it better for them to have wintered on the confines of Cappadocia in hastily constructed huts than in the capital of a kingdom lately recovered? There had been, in short, a suspension of arms, in order that Vologeses might fight some other foe than Corbulo, and that Corbulo might not further risk the glory he had earned in so many years. For as I have related, he had asked for a general exclusively for the defense of Armenia, and it was heard that Caecilius Paetus was on his way. And indeed he had now arrived, and the army was thus divided. The 4th and 12th legions, with the 5th which had lately been raised in Moesia, and the auxiliaries from Pontus, Galatia, and Cappadocia, were under the command of Paetus, while the 3rd, 6th, and 10th legions, and the old soldiery of Syria remained with Corbulo. All else they were to share or divide between them according to circumstances. But as Corbulo could not endure a rival, so Paetus, who would have been sufficiently honored by ranking second to him, disparaged the results of the war, and said repeatedly that there had been no bloodshed or spoil, that the sieges of cities were sieges only in name, and that he would soon impose on the conquered tribute and laws and Roman administration, instead of the empty shadow of a king. About the same time, the envoys of Vologeses, who had been sent, as I have related, to the emperor, returned without success, and the Parthians made open war. Nor did Paetus decline the challenge, but with 2 legions, the 4th and 12th, the first of which was then commanded by Venetilanus Vetonianus, and the second by Calavius Sabinus, entered Armenia, with unlucky omen. In the passage of the Euphrates, which they crossed by a bridge, a horse which carried the consul's official emblems took fright without any apparent cause and fled to the rear. A victim, too, standing by some of the winter tents, which were being fortified, broke its way through them when the work was but half finished, and got clear out of the entrenchments. Then again the soldiers' javelins gleamed with light, a prodigy the more significant, because the Parthian foe fights with missiles. 8. Paetus, however, despising omens, before he had yet thoroughly fortified his winter camp or provided for his corn supply, hurried his army across Mount Taurus for the recovery, as he gave out, of Tigranocerta and the ravaging of the country which Corbulo had left untouched. Some forts, too, were taken, and some glory as well as plunder had been secured, if only he had enjoyed his glory modestly, and his plunder with vigilance, while he was overrunning in tedious expeditions districts which could not be held. The supplies which had been captured were spoiled, and as winter was now at hand, he led back his army and wrote a letter to the emperor, as if the war was finished in pompous language, but barren of facts. 9. Meanwhile, Corbulo occupied the bank of the Euphrates, which he had never neglected, with troops at closer intervals, that he might have no hindrance in throwing a bridge over it from the enemy's cavalry, which was already scouring the adjoining plains with a formidable display. He launched on the river some vessels of remarkable size, linked together by beams, with towers rising from their decks. And with catapults and ballistas, he drove off the barbarians. The stones and spears penetrated their host at a range beyond the reach of the opposing volleys of arrows. The bridge was then completed, and the hills facing us were occupied by our auxiliary infantry, then by the entrenchments of the legions, with such rapidity and such a display of force that the Parthians, giving up their preparations for the invasion of Syria, concentrated all their hopes on Armenia. 10. Paetus, ignorant of the impending danger, was keeping the 5th legion at a distance in Pontus. The rest he had weakened by indiscriminate furloughs, till it was heard that Vologeses was approaching with a powerful force bent on war. He summoned the 12th legion, and then was discovered the numerical feebleness of the source from which he had hoped for the repute of an augmented army. Yet even thus the camp might have been held, and the Parthian foe baffled by protracting the war, had Paetus stood firm either by his own counsels or by those of others. But though military men had put him on his guard against imminent disasters, still not wishing to seem to need the advice of others, he would fall back on some quite different and inferior plan. So now, leaving his winter quarters, and exclaiming that not the fosse or the rampart, but the men's bodies and weapons were given him for facing the foe, he led out his legions, as if he meant to fight a battle. Then, after losing a centurion and a few soldiers, whom he had sent on in advance to reconnoiter the enemy's forces, he returned in alarm. And, as Vologeses had not pressed his advantage with much vigor, Paetus once again, with vain confidence, posted 3,000 chosen infantry on the adjacent ridge of the Taurus in order to bar the king's passage. He also stationed some Pannonian troopers, the flower of his cavalry, in a part of the plain. His wife and son he removed to a fortress named Arsamasata, with a cohort for their defense, thus dispersing the troops which, if kept together, could easily have checked the desultory skirmishing of the enemy. He could, it is said, scarcely be driven to confess to Corbulo how the enemy was pressing him. Corbulo made no haste, that when the dangers thickened, the glory of the rescue might be in hand. Yet he ordered 1,000 men from each of his 3 legions with 800 cavalry, and an equal number of infantry to be in instant readiness. 11 volunteers meanwhile, though he had heard that the roads were blocked by Tacitus, here with infantry, there with cavalry, did not alter his plan, but drove off the latter by the menace of an attack, and crushed the legionaries. Only one centurion, Tarquinius Crescens, dared to defend a tower in which he was keeping guard. He had often sallied out, and cut to pieces such of the barbarians as came close up to the walls, till he was overwhelmed with volleys of firebrands. Every foot soldier, still unwounded, fled to remote wilds, and those who were disabled returned to the camp, exaggerating in their terror the king's valor and the warlike strength of his tribes, everything, in short, to the simple credulity of those who trembled with like fear. Even the general did not struggle against his reverses. He had indeed wholly abandoned all the duties of a soldier, and had again sent an entreaty to Corbulo that he would come with speed to save the standards and eagles, and the name yet left to the unfortunate army. They, meantime, he said, would hold to their fidelity while life lasted. 12 Corbulo, perfectly fearless, left half his army in Syria to retain the forts built on the Euphrates, and taking the nearest route, which also was not deficient in supplies, marched through the country of Commagene, then through Cappadocia, and thence into Armenia. Beside the other usual accompaniments of war, his army was followed by a great number of camels laden with corn, to keep off famine as well as the enemy. The first he met of the defeated army was Tacitus, a first-rank centurion, then many of the soldiers whom, when they pleaded various excuses for flight, he advised to return to their standards and throw themselves on the mercy of Tacitus. For himself, he said, he had no forgiveness but for the victorious. As he spoke, he went up to his legions, cheering them and reminding them of their past career, and pointing the way to new glory. It was not to villages or towns of Armenia, but to a Roman camp with 2 legions, a worthy recompense for their efforts, that they were bound. If each common soldier were to have bestowed on him by the emperor's hand the special honor of a crown for a rescued citizen, how wonderfully great the glory, when the numbers would be equal of those who had brought and of those had received deliverance, roused by these and like words into a common enthusiasm. And some, too, were filled with an ardor peculiarly their own by the perils of brothers and kinsfolk. They hurried on by day and night their uninterrupted march. 13. All the more vigorously did Vologeses press the besieged, now attacking the legion's entrenchments, and now again the fortress which guarded those whose years unfitted them for war. He advanced closer than is the Parthian practice, seeking to lure the enemy to an engagement by such rashness. They, however, could hardly be dragged out of their tents, and would merely defend their lives. Some held back by the general's order. Others, by their own cowardice, they seemed to be awaiting Corbulo, and should they be overpowered by force, they had before them the examples of Candium and Numantia. Neither the Samnites, Italian people as they were, nor the Carthaginians, the rivals of the Roman Empire, were, it seemed, equally formidable, and even the men of old, with all their strength and glory, whenever fortune was adverse, had taken thought for safety. The general, although he was overcome by the despair of his army, first wrote a letter to Vologeses, not a suppliant petition, but in a tone of remonstrance against the doing of hostile acts on behalf of the Armenians, who always had been under Roman dominion, or subject to a king chosen by the emperor. Peace, he reminded him, was equally for the interest of both, and it would be well for him not to look only at the present. He indeed had advanced with the whole strength of his kingdom against 2 legions, while the Romans had all the rest of the world with which to sustain the war. 14. To this Vologeses replied nothing to the purpose, but merely that he must wait for his brothers Pacorus and Tiridates, that the place and time of their meeting had been fixed on as the occasion when they would decide about Armenia, and that heaven had granted them a further honor. Well worthy of the Arsacids, the having to determine the fate of Roman legions. Messengers were then dispatched by Tacitus and an interview requested with the king, who ordered Tacitus, the commander of the cavalry, to go. Thereupon Tacitus dwelt on the memories of the Luculli and Pompey, and of all that the Caesars had done in the way of holding or giving away Armenia, while Tacitus declared that we had the mere shadow of possession and of bestowal. But the Parthians, the reality of power, after much arguing on both sides, Monabazazadiadbiani was called the next day to be a witness to the stipulations into which they had entered. It was agreed that the legions should be released from the blockade, that all the troops should quit Armenian territory, and that the forts and supplies should be surrendered to the Parthians. And when all this had been completed, Vologeses was to have full permission to send envoys to Nero. 15. Meanwhile, Tacitus threw a bridge over the river Arsenias, which flowed by the camp, apparently with the view of facilitating his march. It was the Parthians, however, who had required this as an evidence of their victory, for the bridge was of use to them, while our men went a different way. Rumor added that the legions had been passed under the yoke, with other miserable disgraces, of which the Armenians had borrowed imitations. For they not only entered our lines before the Roman army began to retire, but also stood about the camp streets, recognizing and dragging off slaves or beasts of burden which we had previously captured. They even seized clothes and detained weapons, for the soldiers were utterly cowed and gave up everything, so that no cause for fighting might arise. Vologeses, having piled up the arms and bodies of the slain in order to attest our defeat, refrained from gazing on the fugitive legions. He sought a character for moderation after he had glutted his pride. Seated himself on an elephant, he crossed the river Arsenias, while those next to his person rushed through it at the utmost speed of their horses, for a rumor had gained ground that the bridge would give way through the trickery of its builders. But those who ventured to go on it found it to be firm and trustworthy. 16. As for the besieged, it appeared that they had such an abundance of corn that they fired the granaries. And Corbulo declared that the Parthians, on the other hand, were in want of supplies, and would have abandoned the siege from their fodder being all but exhausted, and that he was himself only 3 days' march distant. He further stated that Paetus had guaranteed by an oath before the standards, in the presence of those whom the king had sent to be witnesses, that no Roman was to enter Armenia until Nero's reply arrived as to whether he assented to the peace. Though this may have been invented to enhance our disgrace, yet about the rest of the story there is no obscurity, that in a single day Paetus traversed 40 miles, leaving his wounded behind him everywhere, and that the consternation of the fugitives was as frightful as if they had turned their backs in battle. Corbulo, as he met them with his forces on the bank of the Euphrates, did not make such a display of his standards and arms as to shame them by the contrast. His men, in their grief and pity for the lot of their comrades, could not even refrain from tears. There was scarce any mutual salutation for weeping. The spirit of a noble rivalry and the desire of glory, emotions which stir men in success, had died away. Pity alone survived, the more strongly in the inferior ranks. 17. Then followed a short conversation between the generals. While Corbulo complained that his efforts had been fruitless, and that the war might have been ended with the flight of the Parthians, Paetus replied that for neither of them was anything lost, and urged that the wise should reverse the eagles, and with their united forces invade Armenia, much weakened as it was by the departure of Vologeses. Corbulo said that he had no such instructions from the emperor. It was the peril of the legions which had stirred him to leave his province, and, as there was uncertainty about the designs of the Parthians, he should return to Syria. And even as it was, he must pray for fortune under her most favorable aspect, in order that the infantry, wearied out with long marches, might keep pace with the enemy's untiring cavalry, certain to outstrip him on the plains, which facilitated their movements. Paetus then went into winter quarters in Cappadocia. Vologeses, however, sent a message to Corbulo, requiring him to remove the fortresses on the further bank of the Euphrates, and to leave the river to be, as formerly, the boundary between them. Corbulo also demanded the evacuation of Armenia, by the garrisons posted throughout it. At last the king yielded. All the positions fortified by Corbulo beyond the Euphrates were destroyed, and the Armenians too left without a master. 18. At Rome, meanwhile, trophies for the Parthian war and arches were erected in the center of the Capitoline Hill. These had been decreed by the Senate, while the war was yet undecided, and even now they were not given up, appearances being consulted. In disregard of known facts, and to hide his anxious fears about foreign affairs, Nero threw the people's corn, which was so old as to be spoilt, into the Tiber, with the view of keeping up a sense of security about the supplies. There was no addition to the price, although about 200 ships were destroyed in the very harbor by a violent storm, and 100 more which had sailed up the Tiber by an accidental fire. Nero next appointed 3 ex-consuls, Lucius Piso, Ducenius Gamenus, and Pompeius Paulinus, to the management of the public revenues, and inveighed at the same time against former emperors whose heavy expenditure had exceeded their legitimate income. He himself, he said, made the state an annual present of 60 million sesterces. 19, a very demoralizing custom had at this time become rife, of fictitious adoptions of children, on the eve of the elections or of the assignment of the provinces by a number of childless persons, who, after obtaining along with real fathers praetorships in provinces, forthwith dismissed from paternal control the sons whom they had adopted. An appeal was made to the Senate under a keen sense of wrong. Parents pleaded natural rights and the anxieties of nurture against fraudulent evasions and the brief ceremony of adoption. It was, they argued, sufficient reward for the childless to have influence and distinction, everything, in short, easy and open to them, without a care and without a burden. For themselves they found that the promises held out by the laws, for which they had long waited, were turned into mockery, when one who knew nothing of apparent solicitude or of the sorrows of bereavement could rise in a moment to the level of a father's long-deferred hopes. On this, a decree of the Senate was passed that a fictitious adoption should be of no avail in any department of the public service, or even hold good for acquiring an inheritance. Next came the prosecution of Claudius Timarchus of Crete on such charges as often fall on very influential provincials, whom immense wealth has emboldened to the oppression of the weak. But one speech of his had gone to the extremity of a gross insult to the Senate, for he had repeatedly declared that it was in his power to decide whether the proconsuls who had governed Crete should receive the thanks of the province. Paetus Thrasea, turning the occasion to public advantage, after having stated his opinion that the accused ought to be expelled from Crete, further spoke as follows: "It is found by experience, senators, that admirable laws and right precedents among the good have their origin in the misdeeds of others. Thus the license of advocates resulted in the Cincinnatus bill, the corrupt practices of candidates in the Julian laws, the rapacity of magistrates in the Calpurnian enactments. For in point of time, guilt comes before punishment, and correction follows after delinquency. And therefore, to meet the new insolence of provincials, let us adopt a measure worthy of Roman good faith and resolution, whereby our allies may lose nothing of our protection, while public opinion may cease to say of us that the estimate of a man's character is to be found anywhere rather than in the judgment of our citizens. Formerly, it was not only a praetor or a consul, but private persons also, who were sent to inspect the provinces, and to report what they thought about each man's loyalty, and nations were timidly sensitive to the opinion of individuals. But now we court foreigners and flatter them, and just as there is a vote of thanks at anyone's pleasure, so even more eagerly is a prosecution decided on. Well, let it be decided on, and let the provincials retain the right of showing their power in this fashion. But as for false praise which has been extorted by entreaties, let it be as much checked as fraud or tyranny. More faults are often committed while we are trying to oblige than while we are giving offense. Nay, some virtues are actually hated, inflexible strictness, for example, and a temper proof against partiality. Consequently, our magistrate's early career is generally better than his close, which deteriorates when we are anxiously seeking votes like candidates. If such practices are stopped, our provinces will be ruled more equitably and more steadily. For as the dread of a charge of extortion has been a check to rapacity, So by prohibiting the vote of thanks, will the pursuit of popularity be restrained? 22:2. This opinion was hailed with great unanimity, but the Senate's resolution could not be finally passed, as the consuls decided there had been no formal motion on the subject. Then, at the emperor's suggestion, they decreed that no one was to propose to any council of our allies that a vote of thanks ought to be given in the Senate to propraetors or proconsuls, and that no one was to discharge such a mission. During the same consulship, a gymnasium was wholly consumed by a stroke of lightning, and a statue of Nero within it was melted down to a shapeless mass of bronze. An earthquake too demolished a large part of Pompeii, a populous town in Campania, and one of the Vestal virgins, Laelia, died, and in her place was chosen Cornelia of the family of the Cassi. 23. During the consulship of Memmius Regulus and Virginius Rufus, Nero welcomed with something more than mortal joy the birth of a daughter by Papatia, whom he called Augusta, the same title having also been given to Poppaea. The place of her confinement was the colony of Annium, where the emperor himself was born. Already had the Senate commended Poppaea's safety to the gods, and had made vows in the state's name, which were repeated again and again, and duly discharged. To these was added a public thanksgiving, and a temple was decreed to the goddess of fecundity, as well as games and contests after the type of the ceremonies commemorative of Actium. And golden images of the two fortunes were to be set up on the throne of Jupiter of the Capitol. Shows, too, of the circus were to be exhibited in honor of the Claudian and Domitian families at Antium, like those at Bovillae in commemoration of the Julia. Transient distinctions, all of them, as within 4 months the infant died. Again, there was an outburst of flattery, men voting the honors of deification of a shrine, a temple, and a priest. The emperor, too, was as excessive in his grief as he had been in his joy. It was observed that when all the Senate rushed out to Annium to honor the recent birth, Thrasea was forbidden to go, and received with fearless spirit an affront which foreboded his doom. Then followed, as rumor says, an expression from the emperor, in which he boasted to Seneca of his reconciliation with Thrasea, on which Seneca congratulated him. And now henceforth the glory and the peril of these illustrious men grew greater. 24. Meanwhile, in the beginning of spring, Parthian envoys brought a message from King Vologeses, with a letter to the same effect. He did not, it was said, repeat his former and frequent claims to the holding of Armenia, since the gods who ruled the destinies of the most powerful nations had handed over its possession to the Parthians, not without disgrace to Rome. Only lately he had besieged Tigranes. Afterwards he let Paetus and his legions depart in safety when he could have destroyed them. He had tried force with a satisfactory result. He had also given clemency a trial. Nor would Tiridates refuse a journey to Rome to receive the crown, were he not detained at home by the duties of a sacred office. He was ready to go to the emperor's image in the Roman headquarters, and there, in the presence of the legions, inaugurate his reign. 25. As Paetus's dispatch contradicted this letter from Vologeses and implied that matters were unchanged, the centurion, who had arrived with the envoys, was questioned as to the state of Armenia. He replied that all the Romans had quitted it. Then was perceived the mockery of the barbarians in petitioning for what they had wrested from us, and Nero consulted with the chief men of the state whether they should accept a dangerous war or a disgraceful peace. There was no hesitation about war. Corbulo, who had known our soldiers and the enemy for so many years, was appointed to conduct it, that there might be no more blunders through any other officer's incapacity, for people were utterly disgusted with Paetus. So the envoys were sent back without an answer, but with some presents, in order to inspire a hope that Tiridates would not make the same request in vain, if only he presented his petition in person. The administration of Syria was entrusted to Caius Idius and the military forces to Corbulo, to which was added the 15th Legion, under the leadership of Marius Celsus from Pannonia. Kings, prefects, and procurators, and all the praetors who governed the neighboring provinces to obey Corbulo's commands. As his powers were enlarged on much the same scale as that which the Roman people had granted to Gnaeus Pompeius on the eve of his war against the pirates. When Paetus returned and dreaded something worse, the emperor thought it enough to reproach him with a jest to the effect that he pardoned him at once, lest one so ready to take fright might sink under prolonged suspense. 26. Corbulo, meantime, transferred to Syria the 4th and 12th legions, which, from the loss of their bravest men and the panic of the remainder, seemed quite unfit for battle, and led thence into Armenia the 3rd and 6th legion, troops in thorough efficiency and trained by frequent and successful service. And he added to his army the 5th legion, which, having been quartered in Pontus, had known nothing of disaster, with men of the 15th lately brought up, and picked veterans from Illyricum and Egypt, and all the allied cavalry and infantry, and the auxiliaries of the tributary princes, which had been concentrated at Melitene, where he was preparing to cross the Euphrates. Then, after the due lustration of his army, he called them together for an harangue, and began with grand allusions to the imperial auspices and to his own achievements, while he attributed their disasters to the incapacity of Tacitus. He spoke with much impressiveness, which in him, as a military man, was as good as eloquence. 27. He then pursued the route opened up in former days by Lucius Lucullus, clearing away the obstructions of long years. Envoys who came to him from Tiridates and Vologeses about peace, he did not repulse, but sent back with them some centurions with a message anything but harsh. Matters, he said, have not yet gone so far as to require the extremity of war. Many successes have fallen to the lot of Rome, some to that of Parthia as a warning against pride. Therefore, it is to the advantage of Tiridates to accept as a gift a kingdom yet unhurt by the ravages of war, and Vologeses will better consult the welfare of the Parthian people by an alliance with Rome than by mutual injuries. I know how much there is of internal discord, and over what untamably fierce tribes he reigns. My emperor, on the other hand, has undisturbed peace all around him, and this is his only war. In an instant, Corbulo backed up his advice by a menacing attitude. He drove from their possessions the nobles of Armenia, who had been the first to revolt from us, destroyed their fortresses, and spread equal panic throughout the plain and the hill country, among the strong and among the weak. 28. Against the name of Corbulo, no rage, nothing of the hatred of an enemy, was felt by the barbarians, and they therefore thought his advice trustworthy. Consequently, Vologeses was not implacable to the uttermost, and he even asked a truce for some divisions of his kingdom. Tiridates demanded a place and a day for an interview. The time was to be soon, the place that in which Tacitus and his legions had been lately besieged, for this was chosen by the barbarians in remembrance for their more prosperous fortune. Corbulo did not refuse, resolved that a widely different issue should enhance his renown. Nor did the disgrace of Tacitus trouble him, as was clearly proved by the fact that he commanded Tacitus's son, who was a tribune, to take some companies with him, and cover up the relics of that ill-starred battlefield. On the day appointed, Tiberius Alexander, a distinguished Roman knight, sent to assist in the campaign, and Vinianus Annius, Corbulo's son-in-law, who, though not yet of a senator's age, had the command of the 5th legion as legatus, entered the camp of Tiridates. By way of compliment to him, and to reassure him against treachery by so valuable a pledge. Each then took with him 20 horsemen. The king, seeing Corbulo, was the first to dismount, and Corbulo hesitated not a moment, but both on foot joined their right hands. 29. Then the Roman commended the young prince for abandoning rash courses and adopting a safe and expedient policy. Tiridates first dwelt much on the nobility of his race, but went on to speak in a tone of moderation. He would go to Rome and bring the emperor a new glory, a suppliant Arsacid, while Parthia was prosperous. It was then agreed that Tiridates should lay down his royal crown before Caesar's image, and resume it only from the hand of Nero. The interview then ended with a kiss. After an interval of a few days, there was a grand display on both sides. On the one, cavalry ranged in squadrons with their national ensigns. On the other stood the columns of our legions with glittering eagles and standards and images of deities, after the appearance of a temple. In the midst, on a tribunal, was a chair of state, and on the chair a statue of Nero. To this Tiridates advanced, and having slain the customary victims, he removed the crown from his head and set it at the foot of the statue, whereupon all felt a deep thrill of emotion, rendered the more intense by the sight which yet lingered before their eyes, of the slaughter or siege of Roman armies. But now, they thought, the calamity is reversed. Tiridates is about to go, a spectacle to the world, little better than a prisoner. 30 to military glory, Corbulo added courtesy and hospitality. When the king continually asked the reason of whatever he noticed which was new to him, the announcements, for example, by a centurion of the beginnings of each watch, the dismissal of the guests by the sound of a trumpet, and the lighting by a torch from beneath of an altar in front of the headquarters, Corbulo, by exaggerating everything, filled him with admiration of our ancient system. Next day Tiridates begged for time, which, as he was about to enter on so long a journey, might suffice for a previous visit to his brothers and his mother. Meanwhile he gave up his daughter as a hostage, and prepared a suppliant letter to Nero. 31. He then departed and found Pacorus in Media, and Vologeses at Ecbatana, who was by no means unconcerned for his brother. In fact, Vologeses had entreated Corbulo by special messengers that Tiridates might not have to endure any badge of slavery, or have to deliver up his sword, or be debarred the honor of embracing the governors of the provinces, or have to present himself at their doors, and that he might be treated at Rome with as much respect as the consuls. Accustomed, forsooth, to foreign arrogance, he had no knowledge of us, who value the reality of empire and disregard its empty show. 32. That same year, the emperor put into possession of the Latin franchise the tribes of the maritime Alps. To the Roman knights he assigned places in the circus in front of the seats of the people, for up to that time they used to enter in a promiscuous throng, as the Rhodian law extended only to 14 rows in the theater. The same year witnessed shows of gladiators as magnificent as those of the past. Many ladies of distinction, however, and senators disgraced themselves by appearing in the amphitheater. 33. In the year of the consulship of Caius Lecanius and Marcus Licinius, a yet keener impulse urged Nero to show himself frequently on the public stage. Hitherto he had sung in private houses or gardens during the juvenile games, but these he now despised as being but little frequented and on too small a scale for so fine a voice. As, however, he did not venture to make a beginning at Rome, he chose Neapolis because it was a Greek city. From this, as his starting point, he might cross into Achaia, and there, winning the well-known and sacred garlands of antiquity, evoke, with increased fame, the enthusiasm of the citizens. Accordingly, a rabble of the townsfolk was brought together, with those whom the excitement of such an event had attracted from the neighboring towns and colonies, and such as followed in the emperor's train to pay him honor or for various objects. All these, with some companies of soldiers, filled the theater at Neapolis. 34. There an incident occurred, which many thought unlucky, though to the emperor it seemed due to the providence of auspicious deities. The people who had been present had quitted the theater, and the empty building then fell in without harm to anyone. Thereupon Nero, in elaborate ode, thanked the gods, celebrating the good luck which attended the late downfall. And as he was on his way to cross the Sea of Hadria, he rested a while at Beneventum, where a crowded gladiatorial show was being exhibited by Vatinius. The man was one of the most conspicuously infamous sights in the imperial court, bred as he had been in a shoemaker's shop, of a deformed person and vulgar wit, originally introduced as a butt. After a time he grew so powerful by accusing all the best men that in influence, wealth, and ability to injure, he was preeminent even in that bad company. 35. While Nero was frequently visiting the show, even amid his pleasures there was no cessation to his crimes. For during the very same period Torquatus Silanus was forced to die, because over and above his illustrious rank as one of the Junian family, he claimed to be the great-grandson of Augustus. Accusers were ordered to charge him with prodigality and lavishing gifts, and with having no hope but in revolution. They said further that he had nobles about him for his letters, books, and accounts, titles all in rehearsals of supreme power. Then the most intimate of his freedmen were put in chains and torn from him, till, knowing the doom which impended, Torquatus divided the arteries in his arms. A speech from Nero followed, as usual, which stated that though he was guilty and with good reason distrusted his defense, he would yet have lived had he awaited the clemency of the judge. Soon afterwards, giving up Achaia for the present, his reasons were not certainly known, He returned to Rome, there dwelling in his secret imaginations on the provinces of the East, especially East. Then, having declared in a public proclamation that his absence would not be long, and that all things in the state would remain unchanged for Pras, he visited the temple of the capital for advice about his departure. There he adored the gods. Then he entered also the temple of Vesta, and there feeling a sudden trembling throughout his limbs, either from terror inspired by the deity or because from the remembrance of his crimes, he was never free from fear. He relinquished his purpose, repeatedly saying that all his plans were of less account than his love of his Chio entry. He had seen the sad countenances of the citizens. He heard their secret complainings at the prospect of his entering on so long a journey, when they could not bear so much as his brief excursions, accustomed as they were to cheer themselves under mischances by the sight of the emperor. Hence, as in private relationships, the closest ties were the strongest. So the people of Rome had the most powerful claims and must be obeyed in their wish to retain him. These and the like sentiments suited the people, who craved amusement and feared always their chief anxiety, scarcity of corn, should he be absent. The Senate and leading citizens were in doubt whether to regard him as more terrible at a distance or among them. After a while, as is the way with great terrors, they thought what happened the worst alternative. 37. Nero, to win credit for himself, of enjoying nothing so much as the capital, prepared banquets in the public places, and used the whole city, so to say, as his private house. Of these entertainments, the most famous for their notorious profligacy were those furnished by Tigellinus, which I will describe as an illustration, that I may not have again and again to narrate similar extravagance. He had a raft constructed on Agrippa's lake, put the guests on board, and set it in motion by other vessels towing it. These vessels glittered with gold and ivory. The crews were arranged according to age and experience and vice. Birds and beasts had been procured from remote countries and sea monsters from the ocean. On the margin of the lake were set up brothels crowded with noble ladies, and on the opposite bank were seen naked prostitutes with obscene gestures and movements. As darkness approached, all the adjacent grove and surrounding buildings resounded with song and shone brilliantly with lights. Nero, who polluted himself by every lawful or lawless indulgence, had not omitted a single abomination which could heighten his depravity, till a few days afterwards he stooped to marry himself to one of that filthy herd, by name Pythagoras, with all the forms of regular wedlock. The bridal veil was put over the emperor. People saw the witnesses of the ceremony, the wedding dower, the couch, and the nuptial torches. Everything, in a word, was plainly visible, which, even when a woman weds, darkness hides. 38. A disaster followed, whether accidental or treacherously contrived by the emperor, is uncertain, as authors have given both accounts. Worse, however, and more dreadful than any which have ever happened to this city by the violence of fire. It had its beginning in that part of the circus which adjoins the Palatine and Calian hills, where, amid the shops containing inflammable wares, the conflagration both broke out and instantly became so fierce and so rapid from the wind that it seized in its grasp the entire length of the circus. For here there were no houses fenced in by solid masonry, or temples surrounded by walls, or any other obstacle to interpose delay. The blaze in its fury ran first through the level portions of the city, then rising to the hills. While it again devastated every place below them, it outstripped all preventive measures. So rapid was the mischief, and so completely at its mercy the city, with those narrow, winding passages and irregular streets which characterized old Rome. Added to this were the wailings of terror-stricken women, the feebleness of age, the helpless inexperience of childhood, the crowds who sought to save themselves or others, dragging out the infirm or waiting for them, and by their hurry in the one case, by their delay in the other, aggravating the confusion. Often, while they looked behind them, they were intercepted by flames on their side or in their face. Or if they reached a refuge close at hand when this too was seized by the fire, they found that even places which they had imagined to be remote were involved in the same calamity. At last, doubting what they should avoid or whither betake themselves, they crowded the streets or flung themselves down in the fields, while some who had lost their all, even their very daily bread, and others out of love for their kinsfolk, whom they had been unable to rescue, perished, though escape was open to them. And no one dared to stop the mischief because of incessant menaces from a number of persons who forbade the extinguishing of the flames. Because again, others openly hurled brands and kept shouting that there was one who gave them authority, either seeking to plunder more freely or obeying orders. 39. Nero at this time was at Antium and did not return to Rome until the fire approached his house, which he had built to connect the palace with the gardens of Maecenas. It could not, however, be stopped from devouring the palace, the house, and everything around it. However, to relieve the people, driven out, homeless as they were, he threw open to them the Campus Martius and the public buildings of Agrippa, and even his own gardens, and raised temporary structures to receive the destitute multitude. Supplies of food were brought up from Ostia and the neighboring towns, and the price of corn was reduced to 3 sesterces a peck. These acts, though popular, produced no effect, since a rumor had gone forth everywhere that, at the very time when the city was in flames, the emperor appeared on a private stage and sang of the destruction of Troy, comparing present misfortunes with the calamities of antiquity. 40. At last, after 5 days, an end was put to the conflagration at the foot of the Esquiline Hill, by the destruction of all buildings on a vast space, so that the violence of the fire was met by clear ground and an open sky. But before people had laid aside their fears, the flames returned, with no less fury this second time, and especially in the spacious districts of the city. Consequently, though there was less loss of life, the temples of the gods and the porticos which were devoted to enjoyment fell into yet more widespread ruin. And to this conflagration there attached the greater infamy, because it broke out on the Aemilian property of Tigellinus, and it seemed that Nero was aiming at the glory of founding a new city and calling it by his name. Rome, indeed, is divided into 14 districts, 4 of which remained uninjured, 3 were leveled to the ground, while in the other 7 were left only a few shattered, half-burnt relics of houses. 41. It would not be easy to enter into a computation of the private mansions, the blocks of tenements, and of the temples which were lost. Those with the oldest ceremonial as that dedicated by Servius Tullius to Luna, the great altar and shrine raised by the Arcadian Evander to the visibly appearing Hercules, the temple of Jupiter the Stayer, which was vowed by Romulus, Numa's royal palace, and the sanctuary of Vesta, with the tutelary deities of the Roman people, were burnt. So too were the riches acquired by our many victories, various beauties of Greek art, then again the ancient and genuine historical monuments of men of genius, and notwithstanding the striking splendor of the restored city. Old men will remember many things which could not be replaced. Some persons observed that the beginning of this conflagration was on the 19th of July, the day on which the Senonos captured and fired Rome. Others have pushed a curious inquiry so far as to reduce the interval between these 2 conflagrations into equal numbers of years, months, and days. 42. Nero meanwhile availed himself of his country's desolation, and erected a mansion in which the jewels and gold, long familiar objects, quite vulgarized by our extravagance, were not so marvelous as the fields and lakes, with woods on one side to resemble a wilderness, and on the other open spaces and extensive views. The directors and contrivers of the work were Severus and Celer, who had the genius and the audacity to attempt by art even what nature had refused, and to fool away an emperor's resources. They had actually undertaken to sink a navigable canal from the Lake Avernus to the mouths of the Tiber, along a barren shore through the face of hills, where one meets with no moisture which could supply water, except the Pomptine marshes. The rest of the country is broken rock and perfectly dry. Even if it could be cut through, the labor would be intolerable, and there would be no adequate result. Nero, however, with his love of the impossible, endeavored to dig through the nearest hills to Avernus, and there still remained the traces of his disappointed hope. 43 of Rome, meanwhile, so much as was left unoccupied by his mansion, was not built up as it had been after its burning by the Gauls, without any regularity or in any fashion, but with rows of streets according to measurement, with broad thoroughfares, with a restriction on the height of houses with open spaces, and the further addition of colonnades as a protection to the frontage of the blocks of tenements. These colonnades Nero promised to erect at his own expense and to hand over the open spaces, when cleared of the debris, to the ground landlords. He also offered rewards proportioned to each person's position and property, and prescribed a period within which they were to obtain them on the completion of so many houses or blocks of building. He fixed on the marshes of Ostia for the reception of the rubbish, and arranged that the ships which had brought up corn by the Tiber should sail down the river with cargoes of this rubbish. The buildings themselves, to a certain height, were to be solidly constructed, without wooden beams of stone from Gabii or Alba, that material being impervious to fire, and to provide that the water which individual license had illegally appropriated might flow in greater abundance in several places for the public use. Officers were appointed, and everyone was to have in the open court the means of stopping a fire. Every building, too, was to be enclosed by its own proper wall, not by one common to others. These changes, which were like for their utility, also added beauty to the new city. Some, however, thought that its old arrangement had been more conducive to health, inasmuch as the narrow streets with the elevation of the roofs were not equally penetrated by the sun's heat, while now the open space, unsheltered by any shade, was scorched by a fiercer glow. 44. Such, indeed, were the precautions of human wisdom. The next thing was to seek means of propitiating the gods, and recourse was had to the Sibylline books, by the direction of which prayers were offered to Vulcanus, Ceres, and Proserpine. Juno, too, was entreated by the matrons, first in the capital, then on the nearest part of the coast, whence water was procured to sprinkle the fane and image of the goddess. And there were sacred banquets and nightly vigils celebrated by married women. But all human efforts, all the lavish gifts of the emperor and the propitiations of the gods, did not banish the sinister belief that the conflagration was the result of an order. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle, and was exhibiting a show in the circus, while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer, or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. 45. Meanwhile, Italy was thoroughly exhausted by contributions of money. The provinces were ruined, as also the allied nations and the free states, as they were called. Even the gods fell victims to the plunder, for the temples in Rome were despoiled, and the gold carried off, which, for a triumph or a vow, the Roman people in every age had consecrated in their prosperity or their alarm. Throughout Asia and Achaia, not only votive gifts, but the images of deities were seized at Crates and Secundus Carinas having been sent into those provinces. The first was a freedman ready for any wickedness. The latter, as far as speech went, was thoroughly trained in Greek learning, but he had not imbued his heart with sound principles. Seneca, it was said to avert from himself the obloquy of sacrilege, begged for the seclusion of a remote rural retreat, and when it was refused, feigning ill health, as though he had a nervous ailment, would not quit his chamber. According to some writers, poison was prepared for him at Nero's command by his own freedman, whose name was Cleonicus. This Seneca avoided through the freedman's disclosure or his own apprehension, while he used to support life on the very simple diet of wild fruits, with water from a running stream when thirst prompted. During the same time, some gladiators in the town of Praeneste, who attempted to break loose, were put down by a military guard stationed on the spot to watch them, and the people, ever desirous and yet fearful of change, began at once to talk of Spartacus and of bygone calamities. Soon afterwards, tidings of a naval disaster was received, but not from war, for never had there been so profound a peace. Nero, however, had ordered the fleet to return to Campania on a fixed day, without making any allowance for the dangers of the sea. Consequently, the pilots, in spite of the fury of the waves, started from Formia, and while they were struggling to double the promontory of Misenum, they were dashed by a violent southwest wind on the shores of Cumae, and lost, in all directions, a number of their triremes with some smaller vessels. 47. At the close of the year, people talked much about prodigies, presaging impending evils. Never were lightning flashes more frequent, and a comet too appeared, for which Nero always made propitiation with noble blood. Human and other births with two heads were exposed to public view, or were discovered in those sacrifices in which it is usual to immolate victims in a pregnant condition. And in the district of Placentia, close to the road, a calf was born with its head attached to its leg. Then followed an explanation of the diviners that another head was preparing for the world, which, however, would be neither mighty nor hidden, as its growth had been checked in the womb, and it had been born by the wayside. 48. Silius Nerva and Atticus Festinus then entered on the consulship, and now a conspiracy was planned, and at once became formidable, for which senators, knights, soldiers, even women, had given their names with eager rivalry, out of hatred of Nero as well as a liking for Caius Piso, a descendant of the Calpurnian house, and embracing in his connections through his father's noble rank many illustrious families. Piso had a splendid reputation with the people from his virtue or semblance of virtue. His eloquence he exercised in the defense of fellow citizens, his generosity towards friends, while even for strangers he had a courteous address and demeanor. He had, too, the fortuitous advantages of tall stature and a handsome face. But solidity of character and moderation in pleasure were wholly alien to him. He indulged in laxity in display, and occasionally in excess. This suited the taste of that numerous class who, when the attractions of vice are so powerful, do not wish for strictness or special severity on the throne. 49. The origin of the conspiracy was not in Piso's personal ambition, but I could not easily narrate who first planned it, or whose prompting inspired a scheme into which so many entered. That the leading spirits were Subrius Flavus, tribune of a praetorian cohort, and Sulpicius Asper, a centurion, was proved by the fearlessness of their death. Lucanus Annaeus, too, and Plautius Lateranus imported into it an intensely keen resentment. Lucanus had the stimulus of personal motives, for Nero tried to disparage the fame of his poems, and with the foolish vanity of a rival, had forbidden him to publish them. As for Lateranus, a consul-elect, it was no wrong, but love of the state which linked him with the others. Flavius Scavenus and Afranius Quintianus, on the other hand, both of senatorian rank, contrary to what was expected of them, undertook the beginning of this daring crime. Scavenus, indeed, had enfeebled his mind by excess, and his life, accordingly, was one of sleepy languor. Quintianus, infamous for his effeminate vice, had been satirized by Nero in a lampoon, and was bent on avenging the insult. 50. So, while they dropped hints among themselves or among their friends about the emperor's crimes, the approaching end of empire, and the importance of choosing someone to rescue the state in its distress, they associated with them Tullius Senecio, Servius Proculus, Volcatius Araricus, Julius Augurinus, Venatius Gratus, Antonius Natalis, and Marcius Festus, all Roman knights. Of the Senecio, one of those who was especially intimate with Nero, still kept up a show of friendship, and had consequently to struggle with all the more dangers. Nautilus shared with Piso all his secret plans. The rest built their hopes on revolution. Besides Saburius and Sulpicius, whom I have already mentioned, they invited the aid of military strength of Gavius Silvanus and Statius Proximus, tribunes of Praetorian cohorts, and of 2 centurions, Maximus Scoras and Venetus Paulus. But their mainstay, it was thought, was Fannius Rufus, the commander of the guard, a man of esteemed life and character, to whom Tigellinus with his brutality and shamelessness was superior in the emperor's regard. He harassed him with calumnies and had often put him in terror by hinting that he had been Agrippina's paramour and from sorrow at her loss was intent on vengeance. And so when the conspirators were assured by his own repeated language that the commander of the Praetorian Guard had come over to their side, they once more eagerly discussed the time and place of the fatal deed. It was said that Subrius Flavus had formed a sudden resolution to attack Nero when singing on the stage, or when his house was in flames, and he was running hither and thither unattended in the darkness. In the one case was the opportunity of solitude, in the other, the very crowd which would witness so glorious a deed had roused a singularly noble soul. It was only the desire of escape, that foe to all great enterprises, which held him back. 51. Meanwhile, as they hesitated in prolonged suspense between hope and fear, a certain Epicharis, how she informed herself is uncertain, as she had never before had a thought of anything noble, began to stir and upbraid the conspirators. Wearied at last of their long delay, she endeavored, when staying in Campania, to shake the loyalty of the officers of the fleet at Messinum, and to entangle them in a guilty complicity. She began thus. There was a captain in the fleet, Lucius Proculus, who had been one of Nero's instruments in his mother's murder, and had not, as he thought, been promoted in proportion to the greatness of his crime. Either as an old acquaintance of the woman, or on the strength of a recent intimacy, he divulged to her his services to Nero, and their barren result to himself, adding complaints, and his determination to have vengeance, should the chance arise. He thus inspired the hope that he could be persuaded and could secure many others. No small help was to be found in the fleet, and there would be numerous opportunities, as Nero delighted in frequent enjoyment of the sea off Puteoli and Misenum. Epicharis accordingly said more, and began the history of all the emperor's crimes. The Senate, she affirmed, had no power left it, yet means had been provided whereby he might pay the penalty of having destroyed the state. Only let Proculus gird himself to do his part and bring over to their side his bravest soldiers, and he had looked for an adequate recompense. The conspirators' names, however, she withheld. Consequently, the information of Proculus was useless, even though he reported what he had heard to Nero. For Epicharis, being summoned and confronted with the informer, easily silenced him, unsupported as he was by a single witness. But she was herself detained in custody, for Nero suspected that even what was not proved to be true was not wholly false. 52. The conspirators, however, alarmed by the fear of disclosure, resolved to hurry on the assassination at Baiae. In Piso's villa, whither the emperor, charmed by its loveliness, often went, and where, unguarded, and without the cumbrous grandeur of his rank, he would enjoy the bath and the banquet. But Piso refused, alleging the odium of an act which would stain with an emperor's blood, however bad he might be, the sanctity of the hospitable board and the deities who preside over it. Better, he said in the Capitol, in that hateful mansion which was piled up with the plunder of the citizens or in public, to accomplish what on the state's behalf they had undertaken. So he said openly, with however a secret apprehension that Lucius Silenus might, on the strength of his distinguished rank and the teachings of Caius Cassius, under whom he had been trained, aspire to any greatness, and seize an empire which would be promptly offered him by all who had no part in the conspiracy, and who would pity Nero as the victim of a crime. Many thought that Piso shunned also the enterprising spirit of Vestinus, the consul, who might, he feared, rise up in the cause of freedom, or, by choosing another emperor, make the state his own gift. Vestinus, indeed, had no share in the conspiracy, though Nero on that charge gratified an old resentment against an innocent man. 53. At last they decided to carry out their design on that day of the circus games, which is celebrated in honor of Ceres as the emperor who seldom went out, and shut himself up in his house or gardens, used to go to the entertainments of the circus, and access to him was the easier from his keen enjoyment of the spectacle. They had so arranged the order of the plot that Lateranus was to throw himself at the prince's knees in earnest entreaty, apparently craving relief for his private necessities, and being a man of strong nerve and huge frame, hurl him to the ground and hold him down. When he was prostrate and powerless, the tribunes and centurions and all the others who had sufficient daring were to rush up and do the murder, the first blow being claimed by Scaevinus, who had taken a dagger from the temple of safety, or, according to another account, from that of fortune in the town of Ferentum, and used to wear the weapon as though dedicated to some noble deed. Piso, meanwhile, was wait in the sanctuary of Ceres, whence he was to be summoned by Phanius, the commander of the guard, and by the others, and then conveyed into the camp, accompanied by Antonia, the daughter of Claudius Caesar, with a view to evoke the people's enthusiasm. So it is related by Caius Pliny, handed down from whatever source I had no intention of suppressing it, however absurd it may seem, either that Antonia should have lent her name at her life's peril to a hopeless project, or that Piso, with his well-known affection for his wife, should have pledged himself to another marriage, but for the fact that the lust of dominion inflames the heart more than any other passion. 54. It was, however, wonderful how among people of different class, rank, age, sex, among rich and poor, everything was kept in secrecy till betrayal began from the house of Scaevinus, the day before the treacherous attempt. After a long conversation with Antonius Natalis, Scaevinus returned home, sealed his will, and drawing from its sheath the dagger of which I have already spoken, and complaining that it was blunted from long disuse, he ordered it to be sharpened on a stone to a keen and bright point. This task he assigned to his freedman Milichus, at the same time sat down to a more than usually sumptuous banquet, and gave his favorite slaves their freedom and money to others. He was himself depressed, and evidently in profound thought, though he affected gaiety in desultory conversation. Last of all, he directed ligatures for wounds, and the means of stanching blood to be prepared by the same Milichus, who either knew of the conspiracy and was faithful up to this point, or was in complete ignorance, and then first caught suspicions, as most authors have inferred from what followed. For when his servile imagination dwelt on the rewards of perfidy, and he saw before him at the same moment boundless wealth and power, conscience and care for his patron's life, together with the remembrance of the freedom he had received, fled from him, from his wife too. He had adopted a womanly and yet baser suggestion, for she even held over him a dreadful thought, that many had been present, both freedmen and slaves, who had seen what he had, that one man's silence would be useless, whereas the rewards would be for him alone who was first with the information. 55 died. Accordingly, at daybreak, Milichus went to the Servilian gardens, and finding the doors shut against him, said again and again that he was the bearer of important and alarming news. Upon this, he was conducted by the gatekeepers to one of Nero's freedmen, Epaphroditus, and by him to Nero, whom he informed of the urgent danger, of the formidable conspiracy, and of all else which he had heard or inferred. He showed him, too, the weapon prepared for his destruction, and bade him summon the accused. Scaevinus, on being arrested by the soldiers, began his defense with the reply that the dagger about which he was accused had of old been regarded with a religious sentiment by his ancestors, that it had been kept in his chamber, and been stolen by a trick of his freedmen. He had often, he said, signed his will without heeding the observance of particular days, and had previously given presents of money as well as freedom to some of his slaves. Only on this occasion he gave more freely, because as his means were now impoverished and his creditors were pressing him, he distrusted the validity of his will. Certainly his table had always been profusely furnished, and his life luxurious, such as rigid censors would hardly approve. As to the bandages for wounds, none had been prepared at his order, but as all the man's other charges were absurd, he added an accusation in which he might make himself alike informer and witness. 56. He backed up his words by an air of resolution. Turning on his accuser, he denounced him as an infamous and depraved wretch, with so fearless a voice and look that the information was beginning to collapse. When Milicus was reminded by his wife that Antonius Natalis had had a long secret conversation with Scavenus, and that both were Piso's intimate friends. Natalis was therefore summoned, and they were separately asked what the conversation was and what was its subject. Then a suspicion arose because their answers did not agree, and they were both put in irons. They could not endure the sight and the threat of torture. Natalis, however, taking the initiative, knowing as he did more of the whole conspiracy, and being also more practiced in accusing, first confessed about Piso, next added the name of Aeneas Seneca, either as having been a messenger between him and Piso, or to win the favor of Nero, who hated Seneca and saw every means for his ruin. Then Scavenus, too, when he knew the disclosure of Natalis, with like pusillanimity, or under the impression that everything now divulged, and that there could be no advantage in silence, revealed the other conspirators. Of these Lucanus, Quincianus, and Senecio long persisted in denial. After a time, when bribed by the promise of impunity, anxious to excuse their reluctance, Lucanus named his mother Attila, Quincianus, and Senecio, their chief friends, respectively, Lucius Gallus and Annius Pollio 57. Nero, meanwhile, remembering that Epicharis was in custody on the information of Lucius Proculus, and assuming that a woman's frame must be unequal to the agony, ordered her to be torn on the rack. But neither the scourge, nor fire, nor the fury of the men, as they increased the torture that they might not be a woman's scorn, overcame her positive denial of the charge. Thus the first day's inquiry was futile. On the morrow, as she was being dragged back on a chair to the same torments, for with her limbs all dislocated she could not stand, she tied a band, which she had stripped off her bosom in a sort of noose to the arched back of the chair, put her neck in it, and then, straining with the whole weight of her body, wrung out of her frame its little remaining breath. All the nobler was the example set by a freedwoman at such a crisis in screening strangers and those whom she hardly knew, when freeborn men, Roman knights, and senators, yet unscathed by torture, betrayed everyone, his dearest kinsfolk. For even Lucanus and Senecio and Quincianus failed not to reveal their accomplices indiscriminately, and Nero was more and more alarmed, though he had fenced his person with a largely augmented guard. 58. Even Rome itself he put, so to say, under custody, garrisoning its walls with companies of soldiers, and occupying with troops the coast and the river banks. Incessantly were there flying through the public places, through private houses, country fields, and the neighboring villages, horse and foot soldiers, mixed with Germans, whom the emperor trusted as being foreigners. In long succession, troops of prisoners in chains were dragged along and stood at the gates of his gardens. When they entered to plead their cause, a smile of joy on any of the conspirators, a casual conversation, a sudden meeting, or the fact of having entered a banquet or a public show in company was construed into a crime, while to the savage questionings of Nero and Tigellinus were added the violent menaces of Phanius Rufus, who had not yet been named by the informer, but who, to get the credit of complete ignorance, frowned fiercely on his accomplices. When Subius Flavus at his side asked him by a sign whether he should draw his sword in the middle of the trial and perpetrate the fatal deed, Rufus refused and checked the man's impulse as he was putting his hand to his sword hilt. 59. Some there were who, as soon as the conspiracy was betrayed, urged Piso, while Milicus's story was being heard, and Scavenus was hesitating to go to the camp or mount the rostra and test the feelings of the soldiers and of the people. If, said they, your accomplices join your enterprise, those also who are yet undecided will follow, and great will be the fame of the movement once started, and this in any new scheme is all-powerful. Against it Nero has taken no precaution. Even brave men are dismayed by sudden perils. Far less will that stage player, with Tigellinus forsooth and his concubines in his train, raise arms against you. Many things are accomplished on trial, which cowards think arduous. It is vain to expect secrecy and fidelity from the varying tempers and bodily constitutions of such a host of accomplices. Torture or reward can overcome everything. Men will soon come to put you also in chains, and inflict on you an ignominious death. How much more gloriously will you die, while you cling to the state and invoke aid for liberty. Rather, let the soldiers fail, the people be traitors. Provided that you, if prematurely robbed of life, justify your death to your ancestors and descendants. Unmoved by these considerations, Piso showed himself a few moments in public, then sought the retirement of his house, and there fortified his spirit against the worst, till a troop of soldiers arrived, raw recruits, or men recently enlisted, whom Nero had selected because he doubly was afraid of the veterans, imbued, though they were, with a liking for. Piso expired by having the veins in his arm severed. His will, full of loathsome flatteries of Nero, was a concession to his love of his wife, a base woman with only a beautiful person to recommend her, whom he had taken away from her husband on his fence. Her name was Atria Galla, that of her former husband, Domitius Sillus. The tame spirit of the man, the profligacy of the woman, blazoned Piso's infamy. 60. In quick succession, Nero added the murder of Plautius Lateranus, consul-elect, so promptly that he did not allow him to embrace his children or to have the brief choice of his own death. He was dragged off to a place set apart for the execution of slaves, and butchered by the hand of the tribune Statius, maintaining a resolute silence, and not reproaching the tribune with complicity in the plot. Then followed the destruction of Aeneas Seneca, a special joy to the emperor, not because he had convicted him of the conspiracy, but anxious to accomplish with the sword what poison had failed to do. Natalis alone, who divulged Seneca's name to this extent, that he had been sent to Seneca when ailing, to see him and remonstrate with him for excluding Piso from his presence, when it would have been better to have kept up their friendship by familiar intercourse. That Seneca's reply was that mutual conversations and frequent interviews were to the advantage of neither, but still that his own life depended on Piso's safety. Gavius Silvanus, tribune of Praetorian cohort, was ordered to report this to Seneca and to ask him whether he acknowledged what Natalis said, and his own answered. Either by chance or purposely, Seneca had returned on that day from Campania and had stopped at a country house 4 miles from Rome. Thither the tribune came next evening, surrounded the house with troops of soldiers, and then made known the emperor's message to Seneca as he was at dinner with his wife, Pompeia Paulina, and 2 friends. 61. Seneca replied that Natalis had been sent to him and had complained to him in Piso's name because of his refusal to see Piso, upon which he excused himself on the ground of failing health and the desire of rest. He had no reason, he said, for preferring the interest of any private citizen to his own safety, and he had no natural aptitude for flattery. No one knew this better than Nero, who had oftener experienced Seneca's free-spokenness than his servility. When the tribune reported this answer in the presence of Poppaea and Tigellinus, the emperor's most confidential advisers, in his moments of rage, he asked whether Seneca was meditating suicide. Upon this, the tribune asserted that he saw no signs of fear and perceived no sadness in his words or in his looks. He was accordingly ordered to go back and to announce sentence of death. Fabius Rusticus tells us that he did not return in the way he came, but went out of his course to Phanius, the commander of the guard, and having explained to him the emperor's orders, and asked whether he was to obey them, was by him admonished to carry them out, for a fatal spell of cowardice was on them all. For this very Silvanus was one of the conspirators, and he was now abetting the crimes which he had united with them to avenge. But he spared himself the anguish of a word or of a look, and merely sent in to Seneca one of his centurions, who was to announce to him his last doom. 62. Seneca, quite unmoved, asked for tablets on which to inscribe his will, and, on the centurion's refusal, turned to his friends, protesting that as he was forbidden to requite them, he bequeathed to them the only, but still the noblest possession yet remaining to him, the pattern of his life, which, if they remembered, they would win a name for moral worth and steadfast friendship. At the same time he called them back from their tears to manly resolution, now with friendly talk, and now with the sterner language of rebuke. Where, he asked again and again, are your maxims of philosophy, or the preparation of so many years' study against evils to come? Who knew not Nero's cruelty? After a mother's and a brother's murder, nothing remains but to add the destruction of a guardian and a tutor. 63, having spoken these and like words meant, so to say, for all, he embraced his wife. Then, softening a while from the stern resolution of the hour, he begged and implored her to spare herself the burden of perpetual sorrow, and in the contemplation of a life virtuously spent, to endure a husband's loss with honorable consolation. She declared in answer that she too had decided to die, and claimed for herself the blow of the executioner. Thereupon Seneca, not to thwart her noble ambition from an affection too, which would not leave behind him for insult one whom he dearly loved, replied, I have shown you ways of smoothing life. You prefer the glory of dying. I will not grudge you such a noble example. Let the fortitude of so courageous an end be alike in both of us, but let there be more in your decease to win fame. Then by one and the same stroke they sundered with a dagger the arteries of their arms. Seneca, as his aged frame, attenuated by frugal diet, allowed the blood to escape but slowly, severed also the veins of his legs and knees, worn out by cruel anguish. Afraid, too, that his sufferings might break his wife's spirit, and that, as he looked on her tortures, he might himself sink into irresolution, he persuaded her to retire into another chamber. Even at the last moment his eloquence failed him not. He summoned his secretaries and dictated much to them which, as it has been published for all readers in his own words, I forbear to paraphrase. 64. Nero, meanwhile, having no personal hatred against Paulina and not wishing to heighten the odium of his cruelty, forbade her death. At the soldiers' prompting, her slaves and freedmen bound up her arms and stanched the bleeding, whether with her knowledge is doubtful. For as the vulgar are ever ready to think the worst, there were persons who believed that. As long as she dreaded Nero's relentlessness, she sought the glory of sharing her husband's death, but that after a time, when a more soothing prospect presented itself, she yielded to the charms of life. To this she added a few subsequent years, with a most praiseworthy remembrance of her husband, and with a countenance and frame white to a degree of pallor which denoted a loss of much vital energy. Seneca, meantime, as the tedious process of death still lingered on, begged Statius and Gnaeus, whom he had long esteemed for his faithful friendship and medical skill, to produce a poison with which he had some time before provided himself, same drug which extinguished the life of those who were condemned by a public sentence of the people of Athens. It was brought to him, and he drank it in vain, chilled as he was throughout his limbs, and his frame closed against the efficacy of the poison. At last he entered a pool of heated water, from which he sprinkled the nearest of his slaves, adding the exclamation, I offer this liquid as a libation to Jupiter the deliverer. He was then carried into a bath with the steam of which he was suffocated, and he was burnt without any of the usual funeral rites. So he had directed in a codicil of his will, when even in the height of his wealth and power he was thinking of his life's close. 65. There was a rumor that Sabrius Flavus had held a secret consultation with the centurions, and had planned, not without Seneca's knowledge, that when Nero had been slain by Piso's instrumentality, Piso also was to be murdered, and the empire handed over to Seneca as a man singled out for his splendid virtues by all persons of integrity. Even a saying of Flavus was popularly current, that it mattered not as to the disgrace if a harp player were removed and a tragic actor succeeded him. For as Nero used to sing to the harp, so did Piso in the dress of a tragedian. 66. The soldiers' part too in the conspiracy no longer escaped discovery, some in their rage becoming informers to betray Faenius Rufus, whom they could not endure to be both an accomplice and a judge. Accordingly, Scaevinus, in answer to his browbeating and menaces, said with a smile that no one knew more than he did, and actually urged him to show gratitude to so good a prince. Faenius could not meet this with either speech or silence, halting in his words and visibly terror-stricken, while the rest, especially Servius Proculus, a Roman knight, did their utmost to convict him. He was, at the emperor's bidding, seized and bound by Cassius, a soldier, who because of his well-known strength of limb was in attendance. 67. Shortly afterwards, the information of the same men proved fatal to Sabrius Flavus. At first he grounded his defense on his moral contrast to the others, implying that an armed soldier like himself, W, would never have shared such an attempt with unarmed and effeminate associates. Then, when he was pressed, he embraced the glory of a full confession. Questioned by Nero as to the motives which had led him on to forget his oath of allegiance, "I hated you," he replied. "Yet not a soldier was more loyal to you, while you deserved to be loved. I began to hate you when you became the murderer of your mother and your wife, a charioteer, an actor, and an incendiary. I have given the man's very words because they were not like those of Seneca, generally published. Though the rough and vigorous sentiments of a soldier ought to be no less known. Throughout the conspiracy nothing, it was certain, fell with more terror on the ears of Nero, who was as unused to be told of the crimes he perpetrated as he was eager in their perpetration. The punishment of Flavius was entrusted to Vainius Niger, a tribune. At his direction, a pit was dug in a neighboring field. Flavius, on seeing it, censured it as too shallow and confined, saying to the soldiers around him, "Even this is not according to military rule. When bidden to offer his neck resolutely, I wish," said he, "that your stroke may be as resolute." The tribune trembled greatly, and having only just severed his head at 2 blows, vaunted his brutality to Nero, saying that he had slain him with a blow and a half. 68. Sulpicius Asper, a centurion, exhibited the next example of fortitude. To Nero's question why he had conspired to murder him, he briefly replied that he could not have rendered a better service to his infamous career. He then underwent the prescribed penalty. Nor did the remaining centurions forget their courage in suffering their punishment. But Fenius Rufus had not equal spirit. He even put his laments into his will. Nero waited in the hope that Vestinus also, the consul, whom he thought an impetuous and deeply disaffected man, would be involved in the charge. None, however, of the conspirators had shared their counsels with him, some from old feuds against him most, because they considered him a reckless and dangerous associate. Nero's hatred of him had had its origin in intimate companionship. Vestinus, seeing through and despising the emperor's cowardice, while Nero feared the high spirit of his friend, who often bantered him with that rough humor which, when it draws largely on facts, leaves a bitter memory behind it. There was too a recent aggravation in the circumstance of Vestinus, having married Statilia Messalina, without being ignorant that the emperor was one of her paramours. 69. As neither crime nor accuser appeared. Nero, being thus unable to assume the semblance of a judge, had recourse to the sheer might of despotism, and dispatched Gerulanus, a tribune, with a cohort of soldiers, and with orders to forestall the designs of the consul, to seize what he might call his fortress, and crush his train of chosen youths. For Vestinus had a house towering over the forum, and a host of phantom slaves. On that day he had performed all his duties as consul, and was entertaining some guests, fearless of danger, or perhaps by way of hiding his fears when the soldiers entered and announced to him the tribune's summons. He rose without a moment's delay, and every preparation was at once made. He shut himself into his chamber. A physician was at his side. His veins were opened. With life still strong in him, he was carried into a bath, and plunged into warm water without uttering a word of pity for himself. Meanwhile, the guards surrounded those who had sat at his table, and it was only at a late hour of the night that they were dismissed, when Nero, having pictured to himself and laughed over their terror at the expectation of a fatal end to their banquet, said that they had suffered enough punishment for the consul's entertainment. 70. Next he ordered the destruction of Marcus Annaeus Lucanus, as the blood flowed freely from him, and he felt a chill creeping through his feet and hands, and the life gradually ebbing from his extremities. Though the heart was still warm and he retained his mental power, Lucanus recalled some poetry he had composed in which he had told the story of a wounded soldier dying a similar kind of death, and he recited the very line. These were his last words. After him, Senecio, Quincianus, and Scaevinus perished, not in the manner expected from the past effeminacy of their life, and then the remaining conspirators, without deed or word deserving record. Rome all this time was thronged with funerals, the capital with sacrificial victims. One after another, on the destruction of a brother, a kinsman, or a friend, would return thanks to the gods, deck his house with laurels, prostrate himself at the knees of the emperor, and weary his hand with kisses. He, in the belief that this was rejoicing, rewarded with impunity the prompt informations of Antonius Natalis and Servius Proculus. Milichus was enriched with gifts and assumed in its Greek equivalent the name of Savior. Of the tribunes, Gavius Silvanus, though acquitted, perished by his own hand. Statius Proximus threw away the benefit of the pardon he had accepted from the emperor by the folly of his end. Cornelius Martialis, Flavius Nepos, Statius Domitius were then deprived of the tribuneship on the ground, not of actually hating the emperor, but of having the credit of it. Novius Priscus, as Seneca's friend, Glydius Gallus, and Annaeus Pollio, as men disgraced rather than convicted, escaped with sentences of banishment. Priscus and Gallus were accompanied respectively by their wives, Artoria Flexilla and Ignatiu Maximilla. The latter possessed at first a great fortune, still unimpaired, and was subsequently deprived of it, both which circumstances enhanced her fame. Rufius Crispinus, too, was banished on the opportune pretext of the conspiracy, but he was in fact hated by Nero because he had once been Poppaea's husband. It was the splendor of their name which drove Virginius Flavus and Musonius Rufus into exile. Virginius encouraged the studies of our youth by his eloquence, Rufus by the teachings of philosophy. Luvianus Quietus, Julius Agrippa, Blitius Catulinus, Petronius Priscus, Julius Altinus, mere rank and file, so to say, had islands in the Aegean Sea assigned to them. Sedicia, the wife of Scavinus, and Caesonius Maximus were forbidden to live in Italy, their penalty being the only proof they had of having been accused. Attila, the mother of Annaeus Lucanus, without either acquittal or punishment, was simply ignored. All this having been completed, Nero assembled the troops and distributed 2,000 sesterces to every common soldier, with an addition of as much corn without payment as they had previously the use of at the market price. Then, as if he was going to describe successes in war, he summoned the Senate and awarded triumphal honors to Petronius Turpilianus, an ex-consul, to Caxius Nerva, praetor-elect, and to Tigellinus, commander of the praetorians. Tigellinus and Nerva he so distinguished as to place busts of them in the palace, in addition to triumphal statues in the forum. He granted a consul's decorations to Nymphidius, on whose origin as he now appears for the first time, I will briefly touch. For he too will be a part of Rome's calamities, the son of a freedwoman, who had prostituted a handsome person among the slaves and freedmen of the emperors. He gave out that he was the offspring of Caius Caesar, for he happened to be of tall stature, and to have a fierce look, or possibly Caius Caesar, who, like even harlots, had also amused himself with the man's mother. 73 IPI. Nero, meanwhile, summoned the Senate, addressed them in a speech, and further added a proclamation to the people with the evidence which had been entered on records, and the confessions of the condemned. He was indeed perpetually under the lash of popular talk, which said that he had destroyed men perfectly innocent out of jealousy or fear. However, that a conspiracy was begun, matured, and conclusively proved was not doubted at the time by those who took pains to ascertain the truth, and is admitted by those who after Nero's death returned to the capital. When everyone in the Senate, those especially who had most cause to mourn, abased himself in flattery, Salienus Clemens denounced Junius Gallio, who was terror-stricken at his brother Seneca's death, was pleading for his life. He called him an enemy and traitor to the state, till the unanimous voice of the senators deterred him from perverting public miseries into an occasion for a personal resentment, and thus importing fresh bitterness into what, by the prince's clemency, had been hushed up or forgotten. 74. Then offerings and thanksgivings to the gods were decreed, with special honors to the sun, who has an ancient temple in the circus where the crime was planned, as having revealed by his power the secrets of the conspiracy. The games, too, of Ceres in the circus were to be celebrated with more horse races, and the month of April was to be called after the name of Nero. A temple also was to be erected to safety, on the spot whence Scaevinus had taken his dagger. The emperor himself dedicated the weapon in the temple of the capital and inscribed on it, "To Jupiter the Avenger." This passed without notice at the moment. But after the war of Julius Vindex, it was construed as an omen and presage of impending vengeance. I find in the registers of the Senate that Cerealis Anicius, consul-elect, proposed a motion that a temple should as soon as possible be built at the public expense to the divine Nero. He implied indeed by this proposal that the prince had transcended all mortal grandeur and deserved the adoration of mankind. Some, however, interpreted it as an omen of his death, seeing that divine honors are not paid to an emperor till he has ceased to live among men. Book 16 Brian. Fortune soon afterwards made a dupe of Nero through his own credulity and the promises of Caecilius Bassus, a Carthaginian by birth and a man of a crazed imagination, who wrested a vision seen in the slumber of night into a confident expectation. He sailed to Rome, and having purchased admission to the emperor, he explained how he had discovered on his land a cave of immense depth, which contained a vast quantity of gold, not in the form of coin, but in the shapeless and ponderous masses of ancient days. In fact, he said ingots of great weight lay there, with bars standing near them in another part of the cave, a treasure hidden for so many ages to increase the wealth of the present. Venetian Dido, as he sought to show by inference, after fleeing from Tyre, found in Carthage, had concealed these riches in the fear that a new people might be demoralized by a superabundance of money, or that the Numidian kings, already for other reasons hostile, might by lust of gold be provoked to war. To Nero upon this, without sufficiently examining the credibility of the author of the story, or of the matter itself, or sending persons through whom he might ascertain whether the intelligence was true, himself actually encouraged the report and dispatched men to bring the spoil, as if it were already acquired. They had triremes assigned them and crews specially selected to promote speed. Nothing else at the time was the subject of the credulous gossip of the people, and of the very different conversation of thinking persons. It happened, too, that the quinquennial games were being celebrated for the second time, and the orators took from this same incident their chief materials for eulogies on the emperor. Not only, they said, were there the usual harvests, and the gold of the mine with its alloy, but the earth now teemed with a new abundance, and wealth was thrust on them by the bounty of the gods. These and other servile flatteries they invented with consummate eloquence and equal sycophancy. Confidently counting on the facility of his belief, extravagance meanwhile increased on the strength of a chimerical hope, and ancient wealth was wasted, as apparently the emperor had lighted on treasures he might squander for many a year. He even gave away profusely from this source, and the expectation of riches was one of the causes of poverty of the state. Bassus indeed dug up his land and extensive plains in the neighborhood, while he persisted that this or that was the place of the promised cave, and was followed not only by our soldiers, but by the rustic population who were engaged to execute the work, till at last he threw off his infatuation, and expressing wonder that his dreams had never before been false, and that now for the first time he had been deluded, he escaped disgrace and danger by a voluntary death. Some have said that he was imprisoned and soon released, his property having been taken from him as a substitute for the royal treasure. 4. Meanwhile, the Senate, as they were now on the eve of the quinquennial contest, wishing to avert scandal, offered the emperor the victory in song and added the crown of eloquence, that thus a veil might be thrown over a shameful exposure on the stage. Nero, however, repeatedly declared that he wanted neither favor nor the Senate's influence, as he was a match for his rivals, and was certain, in the conscientious opinion of the judges, to win the honor by merit. First, he recited a poem on the stage. Then, at the importunate request of the rabble that he would make public property of all his accomplishments, these were their words, he entered the theater and conformed to all the laws of harp playing, not sitting down when tired, nor wiping off the perspiration with anything but the garment he wore, or letting himself be seen to spit or clear his nostrils. Last of all, on bended knee, he saluted the assembly with a motion of the hand, and awaited the verdict of the judges with pretended anxiety. And then the city populace, who were wont to encourage every gesture even of actors, made the place ring with measured strains of elaborate applause. One would have thought they were rejoicing, and perhaps they did rejoice, in their indifference to the public disgrace. 5. All, however, who were present from remote towns, and still retained the Italy of strict morals and primitive ways. All, too, who had come on embassies or on private business from distant provinces, where they had been unused to such wantonness, were unable to endure the spectacle or sustain the degrading fatigue which wearied their unpractised hands, while they disturbed those who knew their part and were often struck by soldiers stationed in the seats to see that not a moment of time passed with less vigorous applause or in the silence of indifference. It was a known fact that several knights, in struggling through the narrow approaches and the pressure of the crowd, were trampled to death, and that others, while keeping their seats day and night, were seized with some fatal malady. For it was a still worse danger to be absent from the show, as many openly and many more secretly, their business to scrutinize names and faces, and to note the delight or the disgust of the company. Hence came cruel severities, immediately exercised on the humble, and resentments, concealed for the moment but subsequently paid off, towards men of distinction. There was a story that Vespasian was insulted by Phoebus, a freedman, for closing his eyes in a doze, and that, having with difficulty been screened by the intercessions of the well-disposed, he escaped imminent destruction through his grander destiny. 6. After the conclusion of the games, Poppaea died from a casual outburst of rage in her husband, who felled her with a kick when she was pregnant. That there was poison I cannot believe, though some writers so relate, from hatred rather than from belief, for the emperor was desirous of children, and wholly swayed by love of his wife. Her body was not consumed by fire according to Roman usage, but after the custom of foreign princes was filled with fragrant spices and embalmed, and then consigned to the sepulchre of the Julid. She had, however, a public funeral, and Nero himself from the rostra eulogized her beauty, her lot in having been the mother of a deified child, and fortune's other gifts, as though they were virtues. 7. To the death of Poppaea, which, though a public grief, was a delight to those who, recalling the past, thought of her shamelessness and cruelty, Nero added fresh and greater odium by forbidding Caius Cassius to attend the funeral. This was the first token of mischief, nor was it long delayed. Silanus was coupled with Cassius, no crime being alleged, but that Cassius was eminent for his ancestral wealth and dignity of character, Silanus for the nobility of his birth and the quiet demeanor of his youth. The emperor accordingly sent the Senate a speech in which he argued that both ought to be removed from the state, and made it a reproach against Cassius that among his ancestors' busts he had specially revered that of Caius Cassius, which bore the inscription to the party leader. In fact, he had thereby sought to sow the seeds of civil war and revolt from the house of the Caesars, and that he might not merely avail himself of the memory of a hated name to stir up strife, he had associated with him Lucius Silanus, a youth of noble birth and reckless spirit, to whom he might point as an instrument of revolution. Nero next denounced Silanus himself in the same terms as he had his uncle Torquatus, implying that he was already arranging the details of imperial business and setting freedmen to manage his accounts, papers, and correspondence. Imputations utterly groundless and false. Silanus, in truth, was intensely apprehensive, and had been frightened into caution by his uncle's destruction. Nero then procured persons under the name of informers to invent against Lepida, the wife of Cassius and aunt of Silanus, a charge of incest with her brother's son, and of some ghastly religious ceremonial. Volcatius Tullinus and Marcellus Cornelius, senators, and Fabatus, a Roman knight, were drawn in as accomplices. By an appeal to the emperor, these men eluded an impending doom and subsequently, as being too insignificant, escaped from Nero, who was busy with crimes on a far greater scale. 9. The Senate was then consulted, and sentences of exile were passed on Cassius and Silanus. As to Lepida, the emperor was to decide. Cassius was transported to the island of Sardinia, and he was quietly left to old age. Silanus was removed to Ostia, whence it was pretended he was to be conveyed to Naxos. He was afterwards confined in a town of Apulia named Barium. There, as he was wisely enduring a most undeserved calamity, he was suddenly seized by a centurion sent to slay him. When the man advised him to sever his veins, he replied that, though he had resolved in his heart to die, he would not let a cutthroat have the glory of the service. The centurion, seeing that, unarmed as he was very powerful and more enraged than a frightened man, ordered his soldiers to overpower him. And Silanus failed not to resist and to strike blows, as well as he could with his bare hands, till he was cut down by the centurion, as though in battle, with wounds in his breast. 10. With equal courage Lucius Vetus, his mother-in-law Sextia, and his daughter Pelusia submitted to death. They were hated by the emperor because they seemed a living reproach to him for the murder of Rubellius Plautus, son-in-law of Lucius Vetus. But the first opportunity of unmasking his savage wrath was furnished by Fortunatus, a freedman who, having embezzled his patron's property, deserted him to become his accuser. He had as his accomplice Claudius Demianus, whom Vetus, when proconsul of Asia, had imprisoned for his gross misdeeds, and whom Nero now released as a recompense for the accusation. When the accused knew this and saw that he and his freedmen were pitted against each other on an equal footing, he retired to the state of Formiae. There he was put under the secret surveillance of soldiers. With him was his daughter, who, to say nothing of the now imminent peril, had all the fury of a long grief, ever since she had seen the murderers of her husband Plautus. She had clasped his bleeding neck, and still kept by her the blood-stained apparel, clinging in her widowhood to perpetual sorrow, and using only such nourishment as might suffice to avert starvation. Then, at her father's bidding, she went to Neapolis, and as she was forbidden to approach Nero, she would haunt his doors, and implore him to hear an innocent man, and not surrender to a freedman one who had once been his colleague in the consulship. Now pleading with the cries of a woman, now again forgetting her sex and lifting up her voice in a tone of menace, till the emperor showed himself unmoved alike by entreaty and reproach. 11. She therefore told her father by message that she cast hope aside, and yielded to necessity. He was at the same time informed that judicial proceedings in the Senate, and a dreadful sentence, were hanging over. Some there were who advised him to name the emperor as his chief heir, and so secure the remainder for his grandchildren. But he spurned the notion, and unwilling to disgrace a life which had clung to freedom by a final act of servility, he bestowed on his slaves all his ready money, and ordered each to convey away for himself whatever he could carry, leaving only 3 couches for the last scene. Then, in the same chamber, with the same weapon, they sundered their veins, and speedily hurried into a bath, covered each as delicacy required with a single garment, the father gazing intently on his daughter, the grandmother on her grandchild, she again on both, while with rival earnestness they prayed that the ebbing life might have a quick departure, each wishing to leave a relative still surviving, but just on the verge of death. Fortune preserved the due order. The oldest died first, then the others, according to priority of age. They were prosecuted after their burial, and the sentence was that they should be punished in ancient fashion. Nero interposed his veto, allowing them to die without his interference. Such were the mockeries added to murders already perpetrated. While Publius Gallus, a Roman knight, was outlawed for having been intimate with Faenius Rufus and somewhat acquainted with Vetus. To the freedman who was the accuser was given, as a reward for his service, a seat in the theater among the tribune's officers. The month, too, following April or Neronius was changed from Maius into the name of Claudius, and Junius into that of Germanicus, Cornelius Orfitus, the proposer of the motion, publicly declaring that the month Junius had been passed over because the execution of the 2 Torquati for their crimes had now rendered its name inauspicious. 13. A year of shame and of so many evil deeds heaven, also marked by storms and pestilence, Campania was devastated by a hurricane, which destroyed everywhere country houses, plantations, and crops, and carried its fury to the neighborhood of Rome, where a terrible plague was sweeping away all classes of human beings without any such derangement of the atmosphere as to be visibly apparent. Yet the houses were filled with lifeless forms, and the streets with funerals. Neither age nor sex was exempt from peril. Slaves and the free-born populace alike were suddenly cut off, amid the wailings of wives and children, who were often consumed on the very funeral pile of their friends by whom they had been sitting and shedding tears. Knights and senators perished indiscriminately, and yet their deaths were less deplored because they seemed to forestall the emperor's cruelty by an ordinary death. That same year, levies of troupas were held in Narbonne Gaul, Africa, and Asia to fill up the legions of Illyricum, all soldiers in which, worn out by age or ill health, were receiving their discharge. Lugdunum was consoled by the prince for a ruinous disaster by a gift of 4,000,000 sesterces, so that what was lost to the city might be replaced. Its people had previously offered this same amount for the distresses of Rome. 14. In the consulship of Caius Suetonius and Lucius Telesinus and Tistius Socianus, who, as I have stated, had been punished with exile for repeated satires on Nero, having heard that there was such honor for informers and that the emperor was so partial to bloodshed, being himself too of a restless temper, and quick to seize opportunities, made a friend of a man in like condition with himself, one Pemaeans, an exile in the same place, noted for his skill as an astrologer, and consequently bound to many in close intimacy. He thought there must be a meaning in the frequent messages and the consultations, and he learned at the same time that an annual payment was furnished him by Publius Antius. He knew too that Antius was hated by Nero for his love of Agrippina, and that his wealth was sufficiently conspicuous to provoke cupidity, and that this was the cause of the destruction of many. Accordingly, he intercepted a letter from Antius, and having also stolen some notes about the day of his nativity and his future career, which were hidden away among Pamine's secret papers, and having further discovered some remarks on the birth and life of Ostorius Scapula, he wrote to the emperor that he would communicate important news which would contribute to his safety, if he could but obtain a brief reprieve of his exile. Antius and Ostorius were, he hinted, grasping at empire and prying into the destinies of themselves and of the prince. Some swift galleys were then dispatched, and Socianus speedily arrived. On the disclosure of his information, Antius and Ostorius were classed with condemned criminals rather than with men on their trial, so completely indeed that no one would attest the will of Antius till Tigellinus interposed to sanction it. Antius had been previously advised by him not to delay this final document. Then he drank poison, but disgusted at its slowness, he hastened death by severing his veins. 15. Ostorius was living at the time on a remote estate on the Ligurian frontier. Thither a centurion was dispatched to hurry on his destruction. There was a motive for promptitude arising out of the fact that Ostorius, with his great military fame and the civic crown he had won in Britain, possessed too, as he was of huge bodily strength and skill in arms, had made Nero, who was always timid and now more frightened than ever by the lately discovered conspiracy, fearful of a sudden attack. So the centurion, having barred every exit from the house, disclosed the emperor's orders to Ostorius. That fortitude which he had often shown in fighting the enemy Ostorius now turned against himself, and as his veins, though severed, allowed but a scanty flow of blood, he used the help of a slave, simply to hold up a dagger firmly, and then pressing the man's hand towards him, he met the point with his throat. 16. Even if I had to relate foreign wars and deaths encountered in the service of the state with such a monotony of disaster, I should myself have been overcome by disgust, while I should look for weariness in my readers, sickened as they would be by the melancholy and continuous destruction of our citizens, however glorious to themselves. But now a servile submissiveness, and so much wanton bloodshed at home, fatigue the mind and paralyze it with grief. The only indulgence I would ask from those who will acquaint themselves with these horrors is that I be not thought to hate men who perished so tamely. Such was the wrath of heaven against the Roman state, that one may not pass over it with a single mention, as one might the defeat of armies and the capture of cities. Let us grant this privilege to the posterity of illustrious men, that just as in their funeral obsequies, such men are not confounded in a common burial, so in the record of their end they may receive and retain a special memorial. 17. Within a few days, in quick succession, Annaeus Mela, Cerialis Anicius, Rufius Crispinus and Petronius fell, Mela and Crispinus being Roman knights with senatorian rank. The latter had once commanded the praetorians and had been rewarded with the decorations of the consulate. He had lately been banished to Sardinia on a charge of conspiracy, and on receiving a message that he was doomed to die, had destroyed himself. Mela, son of the same parents as Gallio and Seneca, had refrained from seeking promotion out of a perverse vanity which wished to raise a Roman knight to an equality with ex-consuls. He also thought that there was a shorter road to the acquisition of wealth through offices connected with the administration of the emperor's private business. He had too in his son Annaeus Lucanus a powerful aid in rising to distinction. After the death of Lucanus, he rigorously called in the debts due to his estate, and thereby provoked an accuser in the person of Fabius Romanus, one of the intimate friends of Lucanus. A story was invented that the father and son shared between them a knowledge of the conspiracy, and a letter was forged in Lucanus's name. This Nero examined and ordered it to be conveyed to Mela, whose wealth he ravenously desired. Mela, meanwhile, adopting the easiest mode of death, then in fashion, opened his veins after adding a codicil to his will, bequeathing an immense amount to Tigellinus and his son-in-law Casucianus Capito in order to save the remainder. In this codicil he is also said to have written, by way of remonstrance against the injustice of his death, that he died without any cause for punishment, while Rufius Crispinus and Anicius Cerealis still enjoyed life. Though bitter foes to the prince, it was thought that he had invented this about Crispinus, because the man had been already murdered, about Cerealis, with the object of procuring his murder. Soon afterwards, Cerealis laid violent hands on himself, and received less pity than the others, because men remembered that he had betrayed a conspiracy to Caius Caesar. 18. With regard to Caius Petronius, I ought to dwell a little on his antecedents. His days he passed in sleep, his nights in the business and pleasures of life. Indolence had raised him to fame, as energy raises others, and he was reckoned not a debauchee and spendthrift, like most of those who squander their substance, but a man of refined luxury. And indeed his talk and his doings, the freer they were, and the more show of carelessness they exhibited, were the better light for their look of natural simplicity. Yet, as proconsul of Bithynia, and soon afterwards as consul, he showed himself a man of vigor and equal to business. Then falling back into vice, or affecting vice, he was chosen by Nero to be one of his few intimate associates. As a critic in matters of taste, while the emperor thought nothing charming or elegant in luxury unless Petronius had expressed to him his approval of it. Hence jealousy on the part of Tigellinus, who looked on him as a rival and even his superior in the science of pleasure. And so he worked on the prince's cruelty, which dominated every other passion, charging Petronius with having been the friend of Scaevinus, bribing a slave to become informer, robbing him of the means of defense, and hurrying into prison the greater part of his domestics. It happened at the time that the emperor was on his way to Campania, and that Petronius, after going as far as Cumae, was there detained. He bore no longer the suspense of fear or of hope. Yet he did not fling away life with precipitate haste, but having made an incision in his veins, and then, according to his humor, bound them up, he again opened them, while he conversed with his friends, not in a serious strain or on topics that might win for him the glory of courage. And he listened to them as they repeated, not thoughts on the immortality of the soul, or on the theories of philosophers, but light poetry and playful verses. To some of his slaves he gave liberal presents, a flogging to others. He dined, indulged himself in sleep, that death, though forced on him, might have a natural appearance. Even in his will he did not, as did many in their last moments, flatter Nero or Tigellinus or any other of the men in power. On the contrary, he described fully the prince's shameful excesses with the names of his male and female companions and their novelties in debauchery, and sent the account under seal to Nero. Then he broke his signet ring, that it might not be subsequently available for imperiling others. 20. When Nero was in doubt how the ingenious varieties of his nightly revels became notorious, Cilia came into his mind, who, as a senator's wife, was a conspicuous person and who had been his chosen associate in all his profligacy, and was very intimate with Petronius. She was banished for not having, as was suspected, kept secret what she had seen and endured, a sacrifice to his personal resentment. Minucius Thermus, an ex-praetor, he surrendered to the hate of Tigellinus because a freedman of Thermus had brought criminal charges against Tigellinus, such that the man had to atone for them himself by the torture of the rack, his patron by an undeserved death. 21. Nero, after having butchered so many illustrious men, at last aspired to extirpate virtue itself by murdering Thrasea and Berea Seranus. Both men he had hated of old Thrasea on additional grounds because he had walked out of the Senate when Agrippina's case was under discussion, as I have already related, and had not given the juvenile games any conspicuous encouragement. Nero's displeasure at this was the deeper, since this same Thrasea had sung in a tragedian's dress at Patavium, his birthplace, in some games instituted by the Trojan Antenor. On the day, too, on which the praetor Antistius was being sentenced to death for libels on Nero, Thrasea proposed and carried a more merciful decision. Again, when divine honors were decreed to Poppaea, he was purposely absent, and did not attend her funeral. All this Capito Casuchianus would not allow to be forgotten. He had a heart eager for the worst wickedness, and he also bore ill will to Thrasea, the weight of whose influence had crushed him, while envoys from Cilicia, supported by Thrasea's advocacy, were accusing him of extortion. 22. He alleged, too, against him the following charges. Thrasea, he said, at the beginning of the year always avoided the usual oath of allegiance. He was not present at the recital of the public prayers. Though he had been promoted to the priesthood of the 15, he had never offered a sacrifice for the safety of the prince or for his heavenly voice. Though formerly he had been assiduous and unweary in showing himself a supporter or an opponent even of the most ordinary motions of senators, he had not entered the Senate House for 3 years, and very lately, when all were rushing thither with rival eagerness to put down Silanus and Vetus, he had attended by preference to the private business of his clients. This was political schism, and, should many dare to do the like, it was actual war. Capito further added, the country in its eagerness for discord is now talking of you, Nero, and of Thrasea, as it talked once of Caius Caesar and Marcus Cato. Thrasea has his followers, or rather his satellites, who copy not indeed as yet the audacious tone of his sentiments, but only his manners and his looks, a sour and gloomy set bent on making your mirthfulness a reproach to you. He is the only man who cares not for your safety, honors not your accomplishments. The prince's prosperity he despises. Can it be that he is not satisfied with your sorrows and griefs? It shows the same spirit not to believe in Poppaea's divinity as to refuse to swear obedience to the acts of the divine Augustus and the divine Julius. He contemns religious rites. He annuls laws. The daily records of the Roman people are read attentively in the provinces and the armies that they may know what Thrasea has not done. Either let us go over to his system if it is better than ours, or let those who desire change have their leader and adviser taken from them. That sect of his gave birth to the Tuberans and Fabini, names hateful even to the old republic. They make a show of freedom to overturn the empire. Should they destroy it, they will attack freedom itself. In vain have you banished Cassius if you are going to allow rivals of the Brudi to multiply and flourish. Finally, write nothing yourself about Thrasea. Leave the Senate to decide for us. Nero further stimulated the eager wrath of Casuchianus, and associated with him the pungent eloquence of Marcellus Eprius. 23. As for the impeachment of Berea Seranus, Ostorius Sabinus, a Roman knight, had already claimed it for himself. It arose out of his proconsulate of Asia, where he increased the prince's animosity by his uprightness and diligence, as well as by having bestowed pains on opening the port of Ephesus, and passed over without punishment the violence of the citizens of Pergamos in their efforts to hinder Acratus, one of the emperor's freedmen, from carrying off statues and pictures. But the crime imputed to him was friendship with Plautus and intrigues to lure the province into thoughts of revolt. The time chosen for the fatal sentence was that at which Tiridates was on his way to receive the sovereignty of Armenia. so that crime at home might be partially veiled amid rumors on foreign affairs, or that Nero might display his imperial grandeur by the murder of illustrious men, as though it were a kingly exploit. 24. Accordingly, when all Rome rushed out to welcome the emperor and see the king, Thrasea, though forbidden to appear, did not let his spirit be cast down, but wrote a note to Nero in which he demanded to know the charges against him, and asserted that he would clear himself if he were informed of the crimes alleged and had an opportunity of refuting them. This note Nero received with eagerness, in the hope that Thrasea, in dismay, had written something to enhance the emperor's glory and to tarnish his own honor. When it turned out otherwise, and he himself, on the contrary, dreaded the glance and the defiant independence of the guiltless man, he ordered the Senate to be summoned. 25. Thrasea then consulted his most intimate friends whether he should attempt or spurn defense. Conflicting advice was offered. Those who thought it best for him to enter the Senate house said that they counted confidently on his courage, and were sure that he would say nothing but what would heighten his renown. It was for the feeble and timid to invest their last moments with secrecy. Let the people behold a man who could meet death. Let the Senate hear words, almost a divine inspiration, more than human. It was possible that the very miracle might impress even a Nero. But should he persist in his cruelty, posterity would at least distinguish between the memory of an honorable death and the cowardice of those who perished in silence. 26. Those, on the other hand, who thought that he ought to wait at home, though their opinion of him was the same, hinted that mockeries and insults were in store for him. Spare your ears, they said, taunts and revilings. Not only are Cossutianus and Eprius eagerly bent on crime, there are numbers more daring enough, perchance, to raise the hand of violence in their brutality. Even good men through fear do the like. Better save the Senate, which you have adorned to the last, the infamy of such an outrage, and leave it a matter of doubt what the senators would have decided had they seen Thrasea on his trial. It is with a vain hope we are aiming to touch Nero with shame for his abominations, and we have far more cause to fear that he will vent his fury on your wife, your household, on all others dear to you. And therefore, while you are yet stainless and undisgraced, seek to close life with the glory of those in whose track and pursuits you have passed it. Present at this deliberation was Rusticus Arulenus, an enthusiastic youth, who, in his ardor for renown, offered, as he was tribune of the people, to protest against the sentence of the Senate. Thrasea checked his impetuous temper, not wishing him to attempt what would be as futile and useless to the accused as it would be fatal to the protester. My days, he said, are ended, and I must not now abandon a scheme of life in which for so many years I have persevered. You are at the beginning of a career of office, and your future is yet clear. Weigh thoroughly with yourself beforehand at such a crisis as this the path of political life on which you enter. He then reserved for his own consideration the question whether it became him to enter the Senate. 27. Next day, however, 2 praetorian cohorts under arms occupied the temple of Venus Gentrix. A group of ordinary citizens with swords, which they did not conceal, had blocked the approach to the Senate. Through the squares and colonnades were scattered bodies of soldiers, amid whose looks of menace the senators entered their house. A speech from the emperor was read by his quaestor. Without addressing anyone by name, he censured the senators for neglecting their public duties, and drawing by their example the Roman knights into idleness. For what wonder is it, he asked, that men do not come from remote provinces when many, after obtaining the consulate or some sacred office, give all their thoughts by choice to the beauty of their gardens. Here was, so to say, a weapon for the accusers on which they fastened. 28. Cossutianus made a beginning, and then Marcellus, in more violent tones, exclaimed that the whole commonwealth was at stake. It is, he said, the stubbornness of inferiors which lessens the clemency of our ruler. We senators have hitherto been too lenient in allowing him to be mocked with impunity by Thrasea throwing off allegiance, by his son-in-law Helvidius Priscus indulging similar frenzies, by Peconius Agrippinus, the inheritor of his father's hatred towards emperors, and by Curtius Montanus, the habitual composer of abominable verses. I miss the presence of an ex-consul in the Senate, of a priest when we offer our vows, of a citizen when we swear obedience. Unless, indeed, in defiance of the manners and rights of our ancestors, Thrasea has openly assumed the part of a traitor and an enemy. In a word, let the man want to act the senator and to screen those who disparage the prince come among us. Let him propose any reform or change he may desire. We shall more readily endure his censure of details than we can now bear the silence by which he condemns everything. Is it the peace throughout the world or victories won without loss to our armies which vex him? A man who grieves at the country's prosperity, who treats our public places, theaters, and temples as if they were a desert, and who is ever threatening us with exile. Let us not enable such an one to gratify his perverse vanity. To him the decrees of this house, the offices of state, the city of Rome seem as nothing. Let him sever his life from a country, all love for which he has long lost, and the very sight of which he has now put from him. 29. While Marcellus, with the savage and menacing look he usually wore, spoke these and like words with rising fury in his voice, countenance, and eye. That familiar grief to which a thick succession of perils had habituated the Senate gave way to a new and profounder panic as they saw the soldiers' hands on their weapons. At the same moment, the venerable form of Thrasea rose before their imagination, and some there were who pitied Helvidius too, doomed as he was to suffer for an innocent alliance. What again, they asked, was the charge against Agrippinus, except his father's sad fate, since he too, though guiltless as his son, fell beneath the cruelty of Tiberius. As for Montanus, a youth without a blemish, author of no libellous poem, he was positively driven out in exile because he had exhibited genius. 30. And meanwhile Astorius Sabinus, the accuser of Serranus, entered, and began by speaking of his friendship with Rubellius Plautus and of his proconsulate in Asia, which he had, he said, adapted to his own glory rather than to the public welfare, by fostering seditious movements in the various states. These were bygones, but there was a fresh charge involving the daughter and the peril of the father, to the effect that she had lavished money on astrologers. This, indeed, had really occurred through the filial affection of Servilia, that was the girl's name, who, out of love for her father and the thoughtlessness of youth, had consulted them, only, however, about the safety of her family, whether Nero could be appeased, and the trial before the Senate have no dreadful result. She was accordingly summoned before the Senate, and there they stood facing one another before the consul's tribunal, the aged parent. And opposite to him, the daughter, in the 20th year of her age, widowed and forlorn. Her husband, Annius Pollio, having lately been driven into banishment, without so much as a glance at her father, whose peril she seemed to have aggravated. 31. Then, on the accuser asking her whether she had sold her bridal presents or stripped her neck of its ornaments to raise money for the performance of magical rites, she at first flung herself on the ground and wept long in silence. After a while, clasping the altar steps and altar, she exclaimed, "I have invoked no impious deities, no enchantments, nor aught else in my unhappy prayers, but only that thou, Caesar, and you, senators, might preserve unharmed this best of fathers. My jewels, my apparel, and the signs of my rank I gave up, as I would have given up my lifeblood had they demanded it. They must have seen this, those men before unknown to me, both as to the name they bear and the arts they practice. No mention was made by me of the emperor, except as one of the divinities, but my most unhappy father knows nothing. And if it is a crime, I alone am guilty." 32. While she was yet speaking, Serranus caught up her words and exclaimed that she had not gone with him into the province, that from her youth she could not have been known to Plautus, and that she was not involved in the charges against her husband. "Treat separately," he said, "the case of one who is guilty only of an exaggerated filial piety. And as for myself, let me undergo any fate." He was rushing as he spoke into the embraces of his daughter, who hurried towards him. But the lictors interposed and stopped them both. Place was then given to the witnesses, and the appearance among them of Publius Ignatius provoked as much indignation as the cruelty of the prosecution had excited pity. A client of Serranus, and now hired to ruin his friend, he professed the dignified character of a Stoic, and had trained himself in demeanor and language to exhibit an ideal of virtue. In his heart, however, treacherous and cunning, he concealed greed and sensuality, As soon as money had brought these vices to light, he became an example, warning us to beware just as much of those who, under the guise of virtuous taste, are false and deceitful in friendship, as of men wholly entangled in falsehoods and stained with every infamy. 33. That same day brought with it a noble pattern in Cassius Asclepiodotus, whose vast wealth made him a foremost man in Bithynia. He had honored Serenus in his prosperity with a respect which he did not cast off in his fall, and he was now stripped of all his property and driven into exile. So impartially indifferent is heaven to examples of virtue and vice. Rhaetia, Serranus, and Servilia were allowed the choice of death. Helvidius and Paconius were banished from Italy. Montanus was spared to his father's intercessions on the understanding that he was not to be admitted to political life. The prosecutors, Eprius and Cassucianus, received each 5,000,000 sesterces, Astorius 1,200,000, with the decorations of the quaestorship. 34. Then, as evening approached, the consul's quaestor was sent to Thrasea, who was passing his time in his garden. He had had a crowded gathering of distinguished men and women, giving special attention to Demetrius, a professor of the Cynic philosophy. With him, as might be inferred from his earnest expression of face, and from words heard when they raised their voices, he was speculating on the nature of the soul and on the separation of the spirit from the body, till Domitius Caecilianus, one of his intimate friends, came to him and told him in detail what the Senate had decided. When all who were present wept and bitterly complained, Thrasea urged them to hasten their departure and not mingle their own perils with the fate of a doomed man. Arria, too, who aspired to follow her husband's end in the example of Arria, her mother, he counseled to preserve her life and not rob the daughter of their love of her only stay. 35. Then he went out into a colonnade, where he was found by the quaestor joyful rather than otherwise, as he had learnt that Helvidius, his son-in-law, was merely excluded from Italy when he heard the Senate's decision. He led Helvidius and Demetrius into a chamber, and having laid bare the arteries of each arm, he let the blood flow freely. And as he sprinkled it on the ground, he called the quaestor to his side and said, "We pour out a libation to Jupiter the deliverer. Behold, young man, and may the gods avert the omen. But you have been born into times in which it is well to fortify the spirit with examples of courage." Then, as the slowness of his end brought with it grievous anguish, turning his eyes on Demetrius and Dot, this point the annals are broken off. Much remained to be told about the last 2 years of Nero's reign.